At 24, Susanna Thorne had accepted the cruel label of Barren until her mother's cryptic will changed everything. Her vast fortune, her voice, and even her future were at stake. One condition: secure her legacy within a year or lose it all. Now she has to decide: submit to her ruthless husband's plots or claim a life of her own, duty or a rebellion that might just destroy her. Hello, lovely. If you're enjoying this simmering historical mystery, I'd be so grateful for a like or a subscribe. It helps me bring you more tales of secret medical ledgers, longing, and triumph. And if you're up for it, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read every note, and it always brings a smile to my face. The drawing room clock struck 9, and Susanna watched Gideon's hand move to his waistcoat pocket before the final chime had faded. It was an automatic gesture, one she had observed countless times over their 3 years of marriage. The silver pocket watch emerged, clicked open with practiced efficiency, and his grey eyes, sharp as flint, scanned the face before snapping it shut with a sound that always made her flinch inwardly, though she had long ago mastered the art of keeping her expression serene. "The solicitor should have sent word by now," he said, not looking at her. "Your mother's affairs were always unnecessarily complicated. One would think a woman of her standing would have ensured a more efficient transition." Susanna kept her gaze on the needlework in her lap, a delicate pattern of roses she had been working on for the past week. The stitches were precise, controlled, much like everything else in her carefully managed existence. "Mr. Pemberton mentioned the estate was extensive. These matters take time." Time. Gideon's voice carried the faint edge of contempt he reserved for concepts he considered wasteful. "Yes, I suppose for those without pressing obligations, time is an endless resource." He moved to the window where she had stood earlier, his posture rigid in his perfectly tailored morning coat. "The funeral was well attended, at least. Your mother commanded respect, if not warmth." It was a calculated comment, one designed to remind Susanna of her own failings by comparison. Beatrice Langdon had been formidable, a woman who had built the family fortune through shrewd investments and an iron will after Susanna's father had died young. Susanna, by contrast, was merely the disappointing daughter who had failed to produce an heir, a woman whose value diminished with each passing childless year. "She was remarkable," Susanna agreed quietly, knowing that any defense of her mother would be twisted into evidence of her own inadequacy. Gideon turned from the window, and she felt the weight of his assessment even before she looked up. When she did meet his eyes, she saw the familiar mixture of frustration and cold calculation that had become the hallmark of their private moments. In public he was attentive, solicitous, the devoted husband standing by his unfortunate wife. Behind closed doors, the mask fell away to reveal the transactional nature of their union. "I've been thinking," he said, returning to his chair across from her, "about our situation, about the future of this family." Susanna's needle paused mid-stitch. The future was a topic Gideon approached only when he had already mapped the terrain to his advantage. "Dr. Whitmore mentioned a new specialist in London," she offered, though the words tasted like ash. How many specialists had there been? How many examinations, each more humiliating than the last, all concluding with the same diagnosis that Gideon wielded like a weapon? "No." His response was immediate, definitive. "I think we've exhausted the medical route, Susanna. What I'm speaking of is something more practical." He pulled out the pocket watch again, studying it as though the time had changed significantly in the past few minutes. "Your mother's will, once it's read, will clarify certain financial arrangements. Depending on those arrangements, we may need to consider the reality of our situation more honestly." The threat hung in the air between them, unspoken but perfectly clear: annulment. It was the sword he had been sharpening for months, waiting for the right moment to strike. If Beatrice had left the fortune to him, he would remain married to Susanna just long enough to secure it. If not, he would cast her aside as defective goods, free to seek a more fertile wife who could provide the heir his ambition demanded. "I see," Susanna said, her voice steady despite the cold dread settling in her stomach. She returned her attention to her needlework, the needle moving through the fabric with deliberate precision. Each stitch was a small act of control in a life where control had been systematically stripped away. "I hope you do." Gideon stood, brushing invisible lint from his sleeve. "I have business in the village. I expect to call on Mr. Pemberton and perhaps expedite this process. The longer we wait, the more complicated matters become." He left without waiting for a response, his footsteps echoing down the hallway with the same measured cadence as his pocket watch. Susanna waited until she heard the front door close before setting aside her needlework with trembling hands. The weight of expectations had always been heavy, but never more so than in the years since her marriage. As a girl, she had been Beatrice Langdon's daughter, expected to be clever, composed, and worthy of the family name. As a young woman, she had been the desirable heiress, courted by ambitious men who saw the Langdon fortune reflected in her green eyes. And as a wife, she had become the barren failure, a woman whose worth evaporated with each monthly confirmation that no child would come. Gideon had courted her with the same efficiency he applied to his business ventures. He had been handsome, well-connected, and appropriately deferential to Beatrice. The marriage had seemed like a natural progression, a suitable match that would secure both families' interests. Susanna had been 21, still naive enough to mistake calculation for care. The first year had been tolerable. Gideon had been patient, even kind, as they settled into married life. But as the months passed without the announcement of an heir, his demeanor had shifted. The patience became pointed remarks about her health. The kindness transformed into suggestions that perhaps she wasn't trying hard enough, wasn't fulfilling her wifely duties with sufficient dedication. By the second year, the visits to physicians had begun. Gideon accompanied her to each appointment, his presence a mixture of concerned husband and prosecuting attorney. The examinations were invasive, degrading, conducted by men who spoke about her body as though it were a malfunctioning machine. And each time, the conclusion was the same. Mrs. Vance showed signs of a condition that made conception unlikely, if not impossible. Gideon had received each diagnosis with a grave expression that masked, Susanna suspected, a certain satisfaction. The failure was hers, not his. The shame belonged to her alone, and with each medical pronouncement his leverage increased while her position weakened. Beatrice had watched this deterioration with her characteristic inscrutability. She had never been an affectionate mother, but she had been observant. In the final months of her life, as illness claimed her formidable strength, she had insisted on private conversations with Susanna. They had sat together in Beatrice's bedroom, the air heavy with the scent of medicinal herbs and impending death, and talked about everything except what mattered most. Or so Susanna had thought. Now, watching the rain begin again outside the drawing-room window, she wondered what her mother had truly understood about her marriage to Gideon. Beatrice had been too shrewd to miss the subtle cruelties, the way Gideon's public devotion contrasted with his private coldness. She had built her fortune by reading people's true intentions beneath their polished exteriors. The question was what, if anything, she had done about it. The solicitor's letter, when it finally arrived that afternoon, was delivered by a boy on horseback who looked half drowned from the renewed downpour. Susanna accepted it from the housemaid with hands that appeared steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs. The black wax seal bore her mother's mark, a thornless rose, the Langdon family crest. Susanna traced the impression with one finger, remembering Beatrice's voice during one of their final conversations. "A rose without thorns is ornamental, Susanna. Pretty but purposeless. Remember that you were born a Langdon, not a decoration." At the time, Susanna had assumed it was her mother's way of criticizing her passivity, her failure to assert herself in her marriage. Now, holding the sealed summons to the reading of the will, she wondered if it had been something else entirely. The letter requested her presence and Gideon's at Mr. Pemberton's office the following morning at 10 o'clock sharp. The language was formal, revealing nothing about the contents of the will itself, but there was a postscript written in Beatrice's own distinctive hand. "Come alone first at 9. Susanna read those 4 words 3 times, her mind racing through the implications. Her mother had anticipated that Gideon would insist on attending, had known that Susanna would need protection even from beyond the grave. When Gideon returned that evening, she showed him the letter, omitting mention of the postscript. He read it quickly, his expression unreadable, then checked his pocket watch, as though calculating how this development fit into his carefully constructed timeline. "Tomorrow at 10, then," he said, handing the letter back to her. "I trust you'll be prepared to conduct yourself appropriately, regardless of the outcome." The threat was clear. Show no emotion, make no scene. Accept whatever verdict Beatrice's will delivered with the same stoic grace that had become Susanna's armor and prison. "Of course," she replied, her voice carrying none of the rebellion beginning to kindle beneath her porcelain composure. That night, alone in her bedroom while Gideon worked in his study, Susanna stood before the mirror and studied her reflection. Red hair pulled back in a tight, modest bun, high-collared nightgown buttoned to her throat, pale skin that had rarely seen sunlight in the 3 years since her marriage had transformed her from a person into a problem to be solved or discarded. But her eyes, her mother's green eyes, held something Gideon hadn't managed to extinguish entirely. Not yet. Tomorrow she would discover what Beatrice's mysterious will contained. Tomorrow, the weight of expectations might shift, might crack, might finally become too heavy for even her stoic shell to bear. Tomorrow, everything might change, or nothing would, and the slow suffocation of her existence would continue its measured, watch-timed progression toward an inevitable annulment and the complete erasure of Susanna Thorne. She turned from the mirror and climbed into bed, but sleep was impossible. Outside, the October rain fell steadily, washing away the last traces of the funeral, preparing the ground for whatever would grow from the seeds Beatrice Langdon had planted in her final, cryptic will. Susanna arrived at Mr. Pemberton's office at precisely 9 o'clock, alone. The brass nameplate on the door gleamed despite the morning's persistent drizzle, and she paused with her gloved hand on the handle, steadying herself before entering. The postscript in her mother's handwriting had been clear, and for once, Susanna had chosen to honor Beatrice's wishes over Gideon's assumption that they would arrive together. She had left the house while he was still dressing, citing an errand that needed attending before the appointment. The lie had come surprisingly easily, smooth as silk across her tongue, and Gideon had merely checked his pocket watch and nodded, already calculating how the morning's revelations might serve his purposes. The outer office was modest, but well-appointed, smelling of old paper and beeswax polish. A young clerk looked up from his desk, recognition flickering across his features. "Mrs. Vance, Mr. Pemberton is expecting you. Please go right through." The solicitor's private office was lined with leather-bound volumes and filing cabinets that spoke of generations of carefully guarded secrets. Mr. Pemberton himself rose from behind a massive oak desk, his expression grave but not unkind. He was a man in his 60s, with silver hair and the sort of face that had witnessed countless family dramas played out across the reading of wills. Mrs. Vance, thank you for honoring your mother's request for this private meeting. He gestured to a chair upholstered in dark green velvet. Please, sit. We have matters to discuss before your husband arrives. Susanna settled into the chair, her back straight, hands folded in her lap over her reticule. My mother was always deliberate in her arrangements. Indeed she was. Pemberton returned to his seat, regarding her with an expression that seemed to be measuring something, her composure perhaps, or her capacity to absorb what was coming. Mrs. Langdon visited me 6 months before her death. She was already unwell, though her mind remained as sharp as ever. What she asked me to draft was unconventional. He reached for a document on his desk, the black wax seal already broken. Susanna recognized her mother's crest, the thornless rose that now seemed laden with meaning she had previously missed. Your mother was aware of certain circumstances surrounding your marriage, Pemberton continued carefully. She did not confide the full extent of her knowledge to me, but she made it clear that this will was designed to address those circumstances in a way that would protect your interests. Susanna's heart began to beat faster, though she kept her expression neutral. I see. I'm not certain you do. Not yet. Pemberton opened the document, his eyes scanning the opening paragraphs. When Mr. Vance arrives, I will read the will in its entirety. But your mother wanted you to understand certain elements beforehand so that you would not be caught unprepared by his reaction. The words hung in the air like a warning bell. Susanna found her voice, though it emerged quieter than she intended. What did she do? She made you the primary beneficiary of the Langdon estate. Pemberton met her eyes directly. The entirety of her fortune, including the properties, investments, and liquid assets, passes to you. Not to your husband, not to your sister, to you alone, Susanna Langdon Thorne. The use of her full maiden name, something she hadn't heard in 3 years, struck her like a physical blow. For a moment, she couldn't breathe, couldn't process what she was hearing. The fortune was vast, everyone knew that. Beatrice had been one of the wealthiest women in the county, her investments carefully tended and multiplied over decades. But there's a condition, Pemberton continued, his tone shifting to something that sounded almost like sympathy. What your mother termed the legacy clause. You must secure your legacy within 1 year of her death, or the entire estate will be donated to a charitable foundation she established for that purpose. Secure my legacy, Susanna repeated slowly, her mind racing. What does that mean? The language is deliberately ambiguous. Your mother wrote that you would understand what was required when the time came. Pemberton paused, then added quietly, I believe she intended for the interpretation to be yours alone, not subject to your husband's influence or control. The implication was clear, even if the precise meaning remained elusive. Beatrice had created a puzzle, a test, something that required Susanna to act, rather than simply exist as she had been doing for 3 years. There's more, Pemberton said. The will contains specific provisions regarding your marriage. Any attempt to claim the inheritance through annulment or dissolution of your union will result in immediate forfeiture. Additionally, should it be proven that any family member has engaged in fraud or deception regarding your health or capacity, they will be permanently disinherited and prohibited from benefiting in any way from the estate. Susanna felt the room tilt slightly. Her mother had known. Somehow, Beatrice had understood exactly what was happening in the Vance household, had seen through Gideon's careful facade to the transactional cruelty beneath. Did she? Susanna's voice caught. Did she say anything else? Leave any other instructions? Pemberton reached into a drawer and withdrew a smaller envelope sealed with red wax this time. She left this for you, to be opened in private after the official reading. She was quite specific that Mr. Vance should not know of its existence. Susanna accepted the envelope with trembling fingers, tucking it quickly into her reticule before she could second-guess the decision to conceal it. "Thank you. Your mother was a formidable woman, Mrs. Vance. I believe she intended this will to be her final act of protection, her masterstroke, if you will. But it will require courage on your part to see it through." Pemberton's expression softened slightly. "The question is whether you're prepared for what's coming." Before Susanna could respond, the clerk knocked and opened the door. "Mr. Vance has arrived, sir." Pemberton straightened, his professional mask settling back into place. "Show him in." Gideon entered the office with the confidence of a man expecting good news. He nodded curtly to Pemberton, then turned to Susanna with barely concealed irritation. "I thought we were to arrive together." "I had an errand," she replied calmly, meeting his eyes with a steadiness that surprised them both. "Shall we proceed?" Pemberton gestured to a second chair. "I believe Mrs. Sterling will be joining us as well." As if summoned, Lydia swept into the office in a rustle of expensive black silk and excessive lace. She embraced Susanna with performative sympathy, dabbing at dry eyes with a handkerchief. "Dear sister, such a difficult day." Susanna returned the embrace mechanically, noting how Lydia's blue eyes slid immediately to the documents on Pemberton's desk, calculating and hungry despite the morning costume. Once everyone was seated, Pemberton began the formal reading. His voice was measured and professional as he recited the opening paragraphs. Beatrice's full name and titles, the declaration of sound mind, the revocation of all previous wills. Standard language that revealed nothing. Then came the bequests, small amounts to long-time servants, specific jewelry pieces to distant cousins, a generous donation to the church where Beatrice had been a patron, if not a particularly devout attendee. Lydia received a property in Bath and an annual income that would keep her comfortable, but was a fraction of the total estate. Susanna watched her sister's face tighten with each word, the facade of grief cracking to reveal the calculation beneath, and then Pemberton reached the heart of the matter. "The remainder of my estate, in its entirety, I leave to my daughter Susanna Langdon Thorne, with the following conditions." The reading of the legacy clause seemed to stretch into eternity. Susanna was acutely aware of Gideon beside her, his stillness, the kind that preceded violence. His hand had moved to his pocket watch, gripping it so tightly she could see the white of his knuckles. When Pemberton finished reading the provisions about annulment and fraud, the silence in the room was absolute. "This is absurd." Gideon's voice was quiet, dangerously controlled. Mrs. Langdon was clearly not of sound mind when she drafted this document. To place such conditions on a lawful inheritance, to make such allegations. The will was witnessed by 3 independent parties, including 2 physicians who examined Mrs. Langdon the day of its signing. Pemberton interrupted smoothly. "I assure you it is entirely legal and binding." Lydia leaned forward, her fan snapping open to hide the lower half of her face. "But surely the ambiguity of the legacy clause makes it contestable. How is Susanna meant to secure her legacy when the terms aren't clearly defined?" "The language was Mrs. Langdon's choice," Pemberton replied. "And as I've explained, any attempt to contest or circumvent the will's provisions will result in forfeiture." Gideon stood abruptly, the pocket watch finally emerging from his waistcoat. He checked it with shaking hands, as though the time could somehow alter what had just been read. "I need a moment with my wife, in private." "I'm afraid that won't be possible just now," Pemberton said. "There are documents that require Mrs. Vance's signature, transferring certain immediate assets to her control." The look Gideon directed at Susanna was one she had never seen before. Pure, undisguised fury stripped of all pretense. But she met it without flinching, the weight of her mother's trust settling around her shoulders like armor. The signing took another 20 minutes. Susanna's hand was steady as she wrote her name again and again. Each signature an act of defiance against the years of being told she was defective, worthless, empty. When it was finished, Lydia departed with barely a word, her exit as dramatic as her entrance had been. Gideon waited, his patience clearly exhausted, his jaw clenched so tightly Susanna could see the muscle jumping beneath the skin. The moment they were in the hired carriage, away from Pemberton's office and any witnesses, his control finally shattered. "What did you do?" The words were harsh, accusatory. "What did you say to her before she died?" "Nothing," Susanna replied honestly. "I had no knowledge of the will's contents." "Liar!" He grabbed her wrist, his grip painful. "You manipulated a dying woman, poisoned her against me." "Remove your hand." The command came from somewhere deep within Susanna, a place she hadn't known still existed. Now. Perhaps it was the shock of hearing her speak with such authority, or perhaps he realized they were still in public view, but Gideon released her. The transactional rage in his eyes promised retribution later, in private, where his psychological lashes could be applied without witnesses. "This changes nothing," he said coldly. "You are my wife. What's yours is mine by law. And everyone knows what you are, a barren woman with delusions of competence. Your mother's eccentric final wishes won't change the fundamental reality of our situation." Susanna looked out the carriage window, watching the rain-soaked streets pass by. In her reticule, she could feel the weight of the second envelope, her mother's private message waiting to be read. "We'll see," she said quietly, surprising herself with the words. The carriage ride back to the estate seemed to last both forever and no time at all. Gideon sat in rigid silence, his pocket watch emerging and disappearing in an agitated rhythm that spoke of calculations being made and discarded. Susanna knew what was coming. Behind closed doors, away from servants and solicitors, he would deploy every weapon in his arsenal. He would remind her of her failures, her dependence, her complete unsuitability for managing a fortune. He would paint the legacy clause as an impossible burden, suggest that the kindest thing, the only sensible thing, would be to find a legal way to transfer control to him. But something had shifted during that reading. Beatrice's words, delivered through Pemberton's measured voice, had unlocked something in Susanna that 3 years of psychological abuse had almost, but not quite, extinguished. Her mother had called her Susanna Langdon Thorne, not Mrs. Vance, not the Barren wife, but a woman with her own name, her own identity, her own legacy to secure. The masterstroke was in motion. The question was whether Susanna had the courage to play the game her mother had set in motion, or whether Gideon's transactional rage would crush this fragile rebellion before it could take root. As the carriage turned through the estate gates, Susanna made a choice. She would read her mother's private letter tonight in secret. She would begin to understand what securing her legacy truly meant. And she would stop accepting the label that had defined and diminished her for too long. The war for her future had just begun. And for the first time in 3 years, Susanna Thorne intended to fight. Lydia arrived 3 days after the reading of the will, her carriage pulling up to the estate with a theatrical flourish that announced her presence long before the doorbell chimed. Susanna watched from the upstairs window as her sister descended in a cloud of violet silk, technically still mourning, but the color chosen to complement her blonde hair rather than honor their deceased mother. The private letter from Beatrice remained hidden in Susanna's escritoire, read and reread until she had memorized every cryptic line. "The truth is locked where only thorns can reach it," her mother had written. "Trust your blood, but verify it. They have made you doubt your body. Make them doubt their lies." Susanna had spent the past 3 days analyzing those words, turning them over like puzzle pieces that refused to fit together. Meanwhile, Gideon had maintained an icy silence, leaving early each morning for the village and returning late, his pocket watch consulted with increasing frequency as though time itself had become his enemy. Now, Lydia was here, and Susanna knew with certainty that her sister's visit had been coordinated with Gideon's absence. Darling Susanna. Lydia swept into the drawing room where Susanna had positioned herself with needlework, the same pose of occupied passivity she had perfected over 3 years of marriage. I simply had to come see how you're managing. The will must have been such a shock. Susanna set aside her embroidery and rose to accept her sister's embrace, noting the expensive French perfume and the new lace at Lydia's collar. The property in Bath and annual income had clearly not satisfied her sister's taste for luxury. It was unexpected. Please, sit. Shall I ring for tea? You're so thoughtful. Lydia arranged herself on the settee with practiced grace, her fan appearing in her hand as though by magic. It was painted silk, depicting a garden scene in delicate watercolors, and she used it now to create a gentle breeze despite the October chill in the room. Though I must confess I'm worried about you. You look terribly pale. I've been indoors more than usual. The weather has been discouraging. It's not just your complexion. Lydia leaned forward conspiratorially, the fan partially obscuring her mouth as she spoke. There's something fragile about you, sister. Something that concerns me deeply, especially now that you're burdened with such enormous responsibility. The maid arrived with the tea service before Susanna could respond. She used the interruption to study her sister more carefully. Lydia had always been the beautiful one, the socially accomplished one, the daughter who met every expectation their mother had set. Where Susanna's red hair was considered unusual, Lydia's blonde curls were universally admired. Where Susanna was quiet and observant, Lydia sparkled in drawing rooms and at dinner parties. And where Susanna had failed to produce an heir, Lydia had 3 healthy children with her husband, a minor baronet whose income was respectable but insufficient for Lydia's ambitions. Sugar? Susanna asked, pouring tea into delicate porcelain cups. 2 lumps, thank you. Lydia accepted her cup, sipping delicately before continuing. I spoke with Gideon yesterday in the village. The poor man is beside himself with worry. Is he? Susanna kept her voice neutral, though her pulse quickened. He confided in me, you understand, as family. He's concerned that the stress of Mother's death and the unexpected provisions of the will may be affecting your equilibrium. The fan moved in a slow, measured rhythm, and Susanna noticed how it allowed Lydia to watch her reactions while hiding her own expressions. My equilibrium is perfectly sound. Of course you would say that, darling, but sometimes we're the last to recognize when our minds are under strain. Lydia set down her teacup with a soft clink. Gideon mentioned that you've been sleeping poorly, having strange thoughts. He found you standing in Mother's old bedroom at 3 in the morning last week, talking to yourself. It was a lie, and a clumsy one. Gideon had been away overnight last week on business, but Susanna understood immediately what was happening. Her sister was creating a narrative, building a case for instability that could be used to challenge her competence to manage the inheritance. I haven't been in Mother's bedroom since we cleared her personal effects, Susanna replied calmly, and I sleep quite well, thank you. Denial is often the first sign of a troubled mind. Lydia's voice dripped with false sympathy. I'm not judging you, sister. Given your difficulties, it's only natural that additional stress would exacerbate underlying weaknesses. My difficulties. Susanna repeated the words flatly, understanding now that this conversation had been carefully scripted, probably with Gideon's input. The barrenness, of course, Lydia waved her fan dismissively, as though discussing something inconsequential. Dr. Whitmore explained to us that such conditions often have their roots in nervous disorders. The body and mind are connected in mysterious ways, and when one is afflicted, the other often follows. Dr. Whitmore discussed my private medical matters with you. With family, yes. We're all concerned for your welfare. Lydia leaned forward, placing a gloved hand over Susanna's. I know how desperately you wanted children, how the failure must weigh on you every day. And now, with Mother gone and this impossible legacy clause hanging over you, well, is it any wonder your mind might begin to fracture under the strain? Susanna withdrew her hand slowly, reaching for her own teacup to give herself a moment to think. The pieces were falling into place with horrifying clarity. Lydia was here to establish a pattern of instability, to create witnesses who would later testify that Susanna had been exhibiting signs of mental breakdown. Dr. Whitmore, the family physician who had conducted those degrading examinations, was apparently complicit in spreading rumors about her supposed nervous condition. I appreciate your concern, Susanna said carefully, but I assure you, I'm quite capable of managing my responsibilities. Are you? Lydia's voice sharpened slightly, a crack in the veneer of sisterly care. Because, from where I'm sitting, you look like a woman who's barely holding herself together. Mother always pushed you too hard, expected too much. She never understood that you weren't built for the kind of strength she possessed. It was a masterful performance, Susanna had to admit. Each statement could be interpreted as loving concern while simultaneously reinforcing the narrative of incompetence. If anyone overheard this conversation, they would hear only a worried sister trying to help a struggling sibling. Mother understood me better than anyone, Susanna replied quietly, which is why she structured her will as she did. Lydia's fan snapped shut, the sudden movement revealing the flash of anger in her blue eyes before she could mask it. That will is a cruelty, Susanna. Surely you see that. To place such impossible conditions on someone in your fragile state, it's almost as though she wanted you to fail, or perhaps she wanted me to succeed. Succeed at what? You can barely manage a household, and now you're expected to oversee investments, properties, business dealings. Lydia stood, pacing to the window with agitated energy. Gideon is trying to help you, to shoulder some of this burden, but you're being stubborn, irrational. Is that what he told you to say? Lydia turned, her expression carefully arranged into wounded innocence. I don't know what you mean. I came here out of genuine sisterly affection, and you're treating me like an enemy. Did you come alone, or did Gideon suggest this visit? We may have discussed my concerns for your welfare. Is that so terrible? He's your husband, Susanna. He loves you, despite everything. Lydia's fan reopened, moving in short, sharp movements that betrayed her irritation. He's been patient with your limitations for 3 years. The least you could do is trust his judgment when it comes to complex financial matters you cannot possibly understand. Susanna stood as well, drawing herself up to her full height. She was taller than Lydia by several inches, something she had always minimized by slouching, by making herself smaller to avoid drawing attention. Now she let herself occupy space, let her sister feel the physical disadvantage. I think it's time for you to leave. I haven't finished my tea. But Lydia's protest was weak, thrown off by Susanna's unexpected assertiveness. Nevertheless, Susanna moved to the bell pull, summoning the maid. I'm feeling fatigued, as you so kindly pointed out. I need to rest. Lydia's eyes narrowed, the fan moving faster. This is exactly what I'm talking about, these mood shifts, this paranoia. You're not yourself, Susanna. Perhaps I'm finally becoming myself. The maid appeared, and Susanna requested her sister's cloak with a firmness that left no room for argument. Lydia gathered her belongings with barely concealed fury, the mask of sisterly concern cracking further with each moment. At the door she turned back one final time. "I'll be speaking with Dr. Whitmore about this visit. He should know that your condition is deteriorating. For your own protection, you understand." "Of course," Susanna replied evenly. "Please give my regards to your husband, and to Gideon, when next you see him." The implication hung in the air. Susanna knew they were coordinating, knew this had been a planned assault. Lydia's cheeks flushed, but she said nothing more, departing in a rustle of violet silk and wounded pride. Susanna waited until the carriage had pulled away before allowing herself to sink back into her chair, her hands trembling. The performance of strength had cost her, but she had learned valuable information. Gideon and Lydia were working together, building a case that would paint her as mentally incompetent. Dr. Whitmore was compromised, willing to discuss private medical information and support whatever narrative served their interests. She thought of her mother's letter, the cryptic instruction to verify her blood, to make them doubt their lies. Beatrice had known this attack would come, had understood that Gideon would not accept being cut out of the inheritance without a fight. The pocket watch strategy had failed. Gideon could not simply annul the marriage and take the money. So now he was pursuing a different approach. Prove Susanna mentally unfit, have himself appointed as her guardian or trustee, and control the fortune that way. Susanna moved to her writing desk and retrieved the letter, reading it once more in the fading afternoon light. "Trust your blood, but verify it." What did that mean? Her bloodline was unquestionable. She was Beatrice Langdon's daughter that had never been in dispute. Unless... A thought began to form, shocking in its implications. What if blood didn't refer to lineage, but to something more literal? What if her mother had known something about the medical diagnoses, about the physician's conclusions regarding her supposed barrenness? Susanna recalled the examinations, the way Dr. Whitmore had consulted privately with Gideon after each one, the medical reports she had never been allowed to read herself. She had simply accepted their conclusions because she had been raised to trust authority, to defer to masculine expertise, to believe that her own understanding of her body was less valid than a physician's pronouncement. But Beatrice had not been a woman who accepted anyone's authority without question. If she had suspected deception, she would have investigated. She would have sought verification. The truth is locked where only thorns can reach it. Susanna thought of the thornless rose on the Langdon crest, her mother's final words about not being merely decorative, and suddenly she understood, or at least glimpsed the beginning of understanding. The truth was locked somewhere only a Langdon could access, somewhere protected by the family name itself. The summer estate, Beatrice's private study, the files and papers that had been sealed after her death, waiting for Susanna to claim them as the heir. She would need to go there, to search through her mother's carefully kept records. But she would need to do it without Gideon knowing, without giving Lydia and Dr. Whitmore more ammunition for their campaign to paint her as unstable. That evening, when Gideon returned late, as had become his habit, Susanna was in the drawing room with her needlework, the picture of passive domesticity. He paused in the doorway, his hand moving automatically to his pocket watch. "Lydia visited today," Susanna said before he could speak. "She was very kind, very concerned." Gideon's expression remained neutral, but she saw the calculation in his eyes. "I'm glad. You need family support during this difficult time." "She mentioned that you'd spoken about my state of mind." "Only because I'm worried about you." He moved into the room, his voice taking on that tone of patient condescension she had come to loathe. "The responsibility of the inheritance is too much for you, Susanna. Anyone can see that. Even your own sister is concerned." "Yes," Susanna agreed quietly, playing the role he expected. "It is overwhelming. Perhaps you're right. Perhaps I'm not strong enough for this." She watched relief flicker across his features, quickly masked. He thought he was winning, thought his strategy was working. Let him think that. Let him and Lydia believe they had successfully planted their seeds of doubt. Meanwhile, Susanna would be growing thorns. The opportunity came 5 days later when Gideon announced he would be travelling to London on business matters that would keep him away for 3 nights. He delivered this news over breakfast with the detached efficiency of a man reporting the weather, his pocket watch already in hand as though calculating how quickly he could depart. "I trust you'll manage the household in my absence," he said, though it wasn't really a question. "Dr. Whitmore will call tomorrow to check on your health. I've asked him to be thorough in his examination." Susanna nodded meekly over her tea, playing the compliant wife while her mind raced with possibilities. 3 days. 3 days to search Beatrice's private study at the summer estate without Gideon's watchful presence, without having to account for her movements or explain her sudden interest in her mother's papers. "Of course," she replied. "I'll receive him as you wish." Gideon studied her for a moment, perhaps surprised by her docility, then checked his watch one final time before departing. Susanna waited at the breakfast room window until his carriage disappeared down the long drive, then immediately summoned the housekeeper. "I'll be spending the next few days at the summer estate," she announced, her voice carrying an authority she was still learning to wield. "Going through Mother's personal effects. Please have the staff prepare the house and arrange transportation for this afternoon." The housekeeper, a practical woman named Mrs. Barren, who had served Beatrice for 20 years, regarded Susanna with an expression that might have been approval. "Very good, madam. I'll send word ahead. Will you be requiring a lady's maid to accompany you?" "No. I prefer to do this work alone." Susanna paused, then added, "And Mrs. Brennan, if Mr. Vance should return early or send word asking after me, please tell him I'm resting and not to be disturbed. The grief has been overwhelming." A flicker of understanding passed between them. Mrs. Brennan had witnessed 3 years of Gideon's cold treatment, had seen the transformation of a vibrant young woman into a silent ghost haunting her own home. "Of course, madam. Your privacy will be protected." The summer estate sat 3 miles distant, close enough to reach within the hour, but far enough to feel like a different world. Susanna hadn't visited since before her mother's final illness, avoiding the place where Beatrice's formidable presence had been most concentrated. Now, as the carriage pulled up the overgrown drive, she felt that presence like a magnetic pull. The house was smaller than the main residence, but more personal, built by Beatrice herself after Susanna's father had died. Every detail reflected her mother's sharp intelligence and deliberate choices. The placement of windows to capture morning light, the library positioned for privacy, the study tucked away on the 2nd floor where Beatrice had managed her investments and correspondence. The caretaker staff had done as requested, opening windows to air out rooms that had been closed since Beatrice's death. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight as Susanna climbed the stairs to her mother's study, her heart pounding with a mixture of trepidation and anticipation. The study door was locked, but Mrs. Brennan had provided the key, a small brass thing that had hung on Beatrice's chatelaine for as long as Susanna could remember. The lock turned smoothly, and the door swung open to reveal a room preserved exactly as her mother had left it. The walls were lined with books on subjects ranging from agricultural management to railway investments to medical treatises. A massive desk dominated the center of the room, its surface covered in heavy velvet, the color of deep burgundy. Behind the desk hung a portrait of Beatrice in her prime, perhaps 40 years old. Her green eyes, so like Susanna's own, gazing out with an intensity that seemed to pierce through time itself. Susanna stood before the portrait, studying her mother's face as though seeing it for the first time. There was strength there, certainly, but also something else. A knowing expression, a hint of satisfaction, as though Beatrice had anticipated this exact moment and was pleased to witness it from beyond death. "What did you know?" Susanna whispered to the painted eyes. "What were you protecting me from?" She began with the desk drawers, finding them meticulously organized as expected. Financial ledgers documenting decades of investments, property deeds arranged by date of acquisition, correspondence sorted by importance and tied with ribbon, everything labelled in Beatrice's precise handwriting, everything accounted for. But nothing that explained the cryptic letter, nothing that addressed the question of Susanna's supposed barrenness or the conspiracy she was beginning to uncover. Frustrated, Susanna sat back in her mother's chair, feeling the worn leather conform to her body. How many hours had Beatrice spent here, managing an empire while the world expected her to be merely decorative? How many times had she sat in this exact spot, looking up at her own portrait, drawing strength from the woman she had been? Susanna's gaze drifted across the painted face, noting details she had missed before. The particular tilt of Beatrice's head, the way her right hand rested against the frame of the portrait, fingers positioned as though pointing to something just out of view, as though pointing to the frame itself. Susanna stood abruptly, her skirts rustling in the silent room. She moved closer to the portrait, examining the ornate gilded frame that had always seemed merely decorative. But now, looking more carefully, she noticed something odd about the lower right corner, a slight gap between the frame and the wall, as though it had been moved and not quite settled back into place. With trembling fingers, Susanna reached up and pressed against the right edge of the frame. It swung away from the wall on hidden hinges, revealing a shallow cavity behind the portrait. Inside were 3 leather-bound journals and a locked metal box. Susanna extracted them carefully, her heart hammering so loudly she could hear it in the silent study. The journals were dated, the most recent ending just 2 weeks before Beatrice's death. The metal box was small, perhaps designed to hold documents, with an intricate lock that would require a key Susanna didn't possess. She carried everything to the desk, spreading the journals across the velvet surface, and opened the most recent volume with hands that shook, despite her attempts at composure. The first entry she found was dated 3 years ago, shortly after Susanna's marriage to Gideon Vance. "He is exactly what I feared," Beatrice had written in her bold, slashing script. "Charming in public, calculating in private. I see how he looks at the Langdon holdings rather than at my daughter. But Susanna is besotted, and I cannot forbid the marriage without revealing suspicions I cannot yet prove. So I will watch, and I will wait, and I will prepare for the war I know is coming." Susanna's vision blurred with tears. Her mother had known, had seen through Gideon from the beginning, had understood the danger even while Susanna had been blind to it. She turned the pages, reading entry after entry documenting Beatrice's growing concern. Her mother had hired investigators to look into Gideon's background, discovering debts he had hidden and business ventures that had failed. She had noted the change in Susanna's demeanor, the way her daughter's natural curiosity had been slowly suffocated. And then, 6 months into the marriage, came the entry that made Susanna's blood run cold. Dr. Whitmore called today with his diagnosis. Susanna is barren, he claims, unable to conceive due to some unnamed defect of the womb. Gideon stood beside her during this pronouncement, the picture of sympathetic husband, but I saw satisfaction in his eyes. I asked Whitmore for his medical evidence, and he became evasive, citing patient privacy. When I pressed, he admitted that Gideon had been present during the examination, had in fact suggested certain conclusions based on their private marital relations. This is not medicine, this is manipulation. I have written to Dr. Sarah Westfield in Edinburgh, a woman physician who will not be swayed by a husband's convenient narrative. Susanna had to set the journal down, her hands shaking too violently to continue reading. Dr. Westfield. She knew that name. Her mother had mentioned a physician from Edinburgh visiting the estate late one night, claiming it was a social call. Susanna had thought nothing of it at the time, too wrapped up in her own private shame to question her mother's social calendar. But Beatrice had been investigating, had been seeking independent medical opinion, unwilling to accept Whitmore's diagnosis without verification. She forced herself to continue reading, turning pages that documented a parallel investigation Susanna had never known existed. Beatrice had asked detailed questions about Susanna's monthly cycles, about symptoms and signs that Whitmore had apparently never inquired about. She had compiled a medical history more thorough than any examination Susanna had endured. And then, in an entry from 18 months ago, Beatrice had written, "Dr. Westfield's assessment confirms my suspicions. There is nothing wrong with Susanna. Her cycles are regular, her health robust. Westfield believes that Whitmore's diagnosis was fabricated, possibly at Gideon's insistence, and that any failure to conceive lies not with my daughter, but with her husband. She suggests that Gideon himself may be infertile, and is using Susanna as a convenient scapegoat to hide his own deficiency. I am furious, but I must be strategic. If I reveal this information now, Gideon will simply find another way to maintain control. Better to let him think he has succeeded in his deception while I prepare a trap he cannot escape." The room seemed to tilt around Susanna. 3 years. 3 years of carrying the shame of barrenness, of enduring pitying looks and whispered comments, of believing herself defective and worthless, and all of it had been a lie. Gideon was the infertile one. The diagnosis had been fabricated to serve his purposes, to undermine her confidence and establish a foundation for eventual annulment or worse. Dr. Whitmore had been complicit, willing to violate his medical ethics for reasons Susanna could only imagine, payment perhaps, or professional favors, or simply the comfort of supporting a man's word over a woman's body. She read on, watching her mother's strategy unfold across the journal pages. Beatrice had allowed the rumors to persist, had let Gideon believe his manipulation had succeeded. Meanwhile, she had been gathering evidence, not just medical records, but financial documentation of Gideon's debts, witness statements about his character, proof of his deceptions. "The will must be my final weapon," Beatrice had written in one of her last entries. "It must protect Susanna while teaching her to protect herself. If I simply leave her the fortune, Gideon will find a way to take it. If I expose his lies while I'm alive, he'll destroy the evidence and paint me as a meddling old woman. But if I structure the inheritance correctly, if I give Susanna both the resources and the motivation to discover the truth herself, she will emerge from this not just wealthy but transformed. She will shed the porcelain shell of passive victimhood and become the thorn she was born to be." Susanna closed the journal and sat in silence, absorbing the full magnitude of what her mother had done. The legacy clause wasn't just about securing the inheritance. It was about forcing Susanna to act, to investigate, to discover her own strength. The ambiguous language was intentional, designed to push her out of complacency and into agency. And the provision about fraud, the one that would disinherit anyone caught in deception regarding Susanna's health. That was the trap Beatrice had set for Gideon. If he continued to claim she was barren, if he used that diagnosis to seek annulment or guardianship, Susanna now had the evidence to prove it was a lie. and the moment she revealed that evidence, he would lose everything. But there was still the locked metal box. Susanna examined it carefully, looking for any indication of where the key might be. The lock was small but sophisticated, not something that could be easily forced open without damage. She searched the desk drawers again, finding nothing that resembled a key. Then she remembered her mother's letter, the one Pemberton had given her privately. She retrieved it from her reticule, where she had kept it close since that day, unfolding the worn paper to read the words again with new understanding. Trust your blood, but verify it. They have made you doubt your body. Make them doubt their lies. The truth is locked, where only thorns can reach it. Where only thorns can reach it. Susanna looked down at her left hand, at the gold wedding band Gideon had placed there 3 years ago. But beneath it, barely visible, was an older ring. The Langdon family signet ring her mother had given her on her 18th birthday. Susanna had moved it to her right hand when she married, then stopped wearing it altogether when Gideon had commented that it was too ostentatious, too much of a reminder that she came from money while he had married up. She had put it away in her jewelry box, but now she realized it had never been just a ring. Hurrying to the bedroom that had been kept for her visits to the summer estate, Susanna found her old jewelry box exactly where she had left it. The signet ring was there, heavy gold engraved with the thornless rose crest. But looking at it now with fresh eyes, she noticed that the back of the signet was slightly loose. She twisted it carefully, and it came apart in her hands. Hidden inside the hollow interior was a tiny brass key. Back in the study, her hands steady now with purpose, Susanna inserted the key into the lock on the metal box. It turned smoothly, and the lid opened to reveal a stack of papers and a sealed envelope marked, "For Susanna. Open only when you understand." She understood now. Finally, completely, she understood. The papers in the box were medical records from Dr. Sarah Westfield, documenting her assessment of Susanna's perfect health. There were also financial records showing payments from Gideon to Dr. Whitmore, dated just before the first diagnosis of barrenness. And at the bottom was a medical report about Gideon himself, a confidential assessment Beatrice had somehow obtained, confirming that he was indeed infertile, the result of an illness in his youth that he had hidden from everyone. Susanna opened the final envelope with reverent care. Inside was a letter in her mother's handwriting, the words clearly written in the last days of her life. "My dearest Susanna," it began, "if you are reading this, you have found the courage to search for truth rather than accept comfortable lies. You have begun to grow thorns. The evidence in this box will destroy Gideon's carefully constructed fiction and expose Lydia's complicity. But more importantly, it will free you from the shame that was never yours to carry. You are not barren. You are not defective. You are not worthless. You are my daughter, a Langdon, and you possess strength you have not yet learned to wield. The legacy clause demands you secure your legacy within 1 year. I leave it to you to determine what that means, whether it is bearing an heir, or building a business, or simply learning to exist without apology. Whatever you choose, do it boldly. Do it without shame, and remember that the greatest legacy I can give you is not money, but the truth that sets you free. Your mother, who loved you more than you know, Beatrice." Susanna sat at her mother's desk as the sun set beyond the windows, clutching the letter to her chest. Around her lay the evidence of 3 years of systematic psychological abuse, of medical fraud, of a conspiracy designed to rob her of her inheritance and her identity. But also around her lay proof of her mother's fierce protection, of a woman who had loved her daughter enough to orchestrate an elaborate posthumous rescue. Beatrice had given her not just a fortune but the tools to reclaim her sense of self. The porcelain shell was cracking, and beneath it, finally, Susanna Thorne was beginning to bloom with thorns. Susanna returned from the summer estate the following afternoon, her reticule heavy with the most damning documents from Beatrice's hidden cache. She had left the journals and metal box concealed behind the portrait, but she carried Dr. Westfield's medical assessment, the financial records showing payments to Dr. Whitmore, and her mother's final letter, evidence that would destroy Gideon's carefully constructed narrative when the time was right. But timing was everything, and Susanna was learning to be strategic rather than reactive. Her mother had taught her that lesson through the elaborate choreography of the will. Strike too soon, and Gideon would find a way to discredit the evidence or manufacture new lies. Wait for him to overreach, to commit himself fully to his fraudulent course, and he would be trapped by his own deception. Mrs. Brennan met her at the door with news that made Susanna's newly formed plans shift into sharper focus. "Mr. Vance returned from London early this morning, madam. He seemed agitated when he discovered you were away. I conveyed your message about needing rest, as you instructed." "And his response?" "He asked no further questions, but he's been in his study all day. He had a visitor arrive about an hour ago, your sister, Mrs. Sterling. They're currently in the conservatory." Susanna felt a cold clarity settle over her. Of course Lydia was here. Of course they were meeting while they thought she was safely occupied with grief and solitude. She handed her cloak to the housekeeper and spoke quietly. "I'll be in the music room. I have correspondence to attend to. Please ensure I'm not disturbed, and that Mr. Vance and Mrs. Sterling aren't aware I've returned." Mrs. Brennan's eyes gleamed with understanding. "Very good, madam. Shall I have tea sent to the music room?" "No, thank you, I won't be long." The music room shared a wall with the conservatory, separated by a connecting door that was kept locked but not sealed. Susanna had discovered as a girl that sound travelled remarkably well between the two spaces, especially when one stood near the connecting door, and the conservatory's occupants believed themselves alone. She positioned herself carefully, opening her writing desk as though genuinely intending to work on correspondence while straining to hear the voices filtering through the wall. At first, she could make out only murmurs, but then Gideon's voice rose in frustration, and the words became clear. 3 days I was gone, laying the groundwork with my solicitor, and you're telling me Whitmore is having second thoughts? Not second thoughts, exactly. Lydia's voice was defensive, her usual performative sweetness stripped away in private. But he's nervous about providing written testimony regarding Susanna's mental state. He says without recent examinations to support the claim, it could be challenged. Then he needs to conduct recent examinations. Gideon's footsteps echoed on the conservatory's tile floor, pacing as he did when calculating his next move. That's why I arranged for him to call while I was away. Did he not follow through? He came yesterday, but Susanna had already left for the summer estate. Apparently she's going through Beatrice's personal effects. There was a pause. Then Lydia added with barely concealed anxiety. What if she finds something? Mother was meticulous about her records. What could she possibly find? Beatrice didn't know about Susanna's condition. She only suspected I was motivated by the inheritance which she couldn't prove. That's why she structured the will as she did, thinking she was being clever. The contempt in Gideon's voice was absolute. But the legacy clause works in our favor. Susanna can't possibly secure her legacy as the will demands. She's too timid, too damaged by years of failure. Give her enough time and pressure and she'll crack completely. Susanna's hands clenched on her pen, but she forced herself to remain still, to keep listening. This was exactly what her mother had predicted, Gideon revealing himself when he thought no witnesses could hear. I still think we're moving too quickly, Lydia said. If we pursue the annulment based on her barrenness, people will talk. Society may view you as cruel, abandoning a wife because she can't bear children. Which is why we're not basing the annulment solely on her infertility. Gideon's voice took on the patient tone of someone explaining a strategy to a slower student. We're building a comprehensive case. The barrenness is merely the foundation, a sad but undeniable fact that has placed strain on the marriage. Add to that her increasingly unstable mental state, witnessed by family and medical professionals, and we paint a picture of a woman who cannot fulfill her duties as a wife or manage significant financial responsibilities. And that's where I come in. Lydia's voice gained confidence, warming to her role in the conspiracy. As her loving sister, I've observed her decline with deep concern. I can testify to her paranoid delusions, her accusations that you're trying to steal her inheritance, her inability to make rational decisions. Exactly. We establish that she's incompetent, that the kindest solution is to annul the marriage and place her fortune in more capable hands, mine, as her husband until the annulment is finalized, and then yours, as her closest blood relative, under my management as your brother-in-law. Susanna heard the clink of glass. They were drinking to their scheme, celebrating a victory they hadn't yet achieved, but already considered inevitable. What about the fraud provision in the will? Lydia asked. Mother was specific that anyone engaged in deception regarding Susanna's health would be disinherited. That provision requires proof of deception. Whitmore's diagnosis is documented, supported by multiple examinations over 3 years. What proof could Susanna possibly have that she's not barren? Her own wishful thinking? Gideon laughed, a cold sound that made Susanna's skin crawl. No, that clause was Beatrice's way of trying to intimidate us into good behavior, but she underestimated how thoroughly I've established the medical narrative. Still, we should be cautious. Susanna has been different since the will reading, more assertive. When I visited last week, she practically threw me out of the house. A final flutter of resistance before she collapses entirely. I've seen it before in business negotiations, a desperate show of strength that precedes total capitulation. Gideon's footsteps approached closer to the connecting wall, and Susanna held her breath, praying he wouldn't notice the slight gap beneath the door that allowed sound to travel. Within 2 months, we'll have enough documented evidence of instability to petition for annulment. Within 3, the fortune will be under our control. And Susanna will be quietly placed in a private sanatorium for her own protection, of course. Somewhere comfortable but secure, where she can't contest the proceedings or make wild accusations. Your husband's family has connections to an excellent facility in Wales, I believe. They do. Lydia's voice had lost its earlier nervousness, replaced by cold calculation. Remote, discreet, and very difficult to leave without family permission. Susanna felt bile rise in her throat. They weren't just planning to steal her inheritance. They intended to lock her away, to imprison her under the guise of medical care. She would disappear into an asylum while Gideon and Lydia divided the Langdon fortune between them, and no one would question the tragic necessity of confining a barren, mentally unstable woman for her own good. There's one more complication, Gideon said after a moment. The legacy clause deadline. We have only 9 months remaining before the estate reverts to Beatrice's charitable foundation. We need to move quickly enough to secure control before that deadline, but slowly enough that the process appears legitimate. Can it be done? If we execute the plan precisely. I've already consulted with my solicitor about the legal mechanisms for declaring someone mentally incompetent, with proper documentation from Whitmore and supporting testimony from family. That's you. Dear sister, we can have a judgment within 6 weeks. The annulment proceedings can run concurrently. By the time anyone questions the process, it will be finalized. And if Susanna fights it, with what resources? I control the household finances. Any solicitor she might try to hire would need to be paid, and I'll ensure she has no access to funds. Besides, Who would believe her? A barren woman suffering a mental breakdown, making paranoid accusations against her devoted husband. Society will view her with pity at best, contempt at worst. Susanna heard Lydia's fan snap open. That habitual gesture that signaled her sister was processing information, calculating outcomes. I suppose you're right. Mother always said Susanna was too soft for the real world. She needed someone strong to guide her, to make difficult decisions on her behalf. And fortunately, she married someone capable of providing exactly that. The smugness in Gideon's voice was palpable. Now, let's discuss the division of assets once control is established. I propose a 60-40 split in my favor, given that I'm assuming the greater legal risk and managing the day-to-day proceedings. 60-40. I'm the blood relative, Gideon. Without my testimony about her mental state, your case is significantly weaker. I think 50-50 is more appropriate. They began to haggle over the precise terms of their betrayal, debating percentages and property allocations like merchants dividing inventory. Susanna listened to every word, committing it to memory, her initial shock hardening into something cold and sharp. This was what Beatrice had known would happen. This was why the will had been structured as it was, why the evidence had been hidden where only Susanna could find it. Her mother had understood that Gideon would never accept being cut out of the fortune, that he would pursue increasingly desperate measures to maintain control. And Lydia, beautiful, perfect Lydia, who had always been the favored daughter in society's eyes, was willing to see her own sister locked away in an asylum to secure a larger inheritance. The voices in the conservatory dropped lower, moving into specific discussion of which properties to sell first, which investments to liquidate. Susanna had heard enough. She moved away from the connecting door and sat at her writing desk, her hands surprisingly steady as she pulled out fresh paper. She began to write, documenting everything she had just overheard: the planned annulment, the conspiracy with Dr. Whitmore, the intention to have her declared incompetent and confined. The words flowed with a clarity born of fury and purpose. This would be her testimony, dated and detailed, to be held with the other evidence until the moment came to spring Beatrice's trap. Because now Susanna understood the full scope of her mother's strategy. The legacy clause wasn't just about securing an heir or building a business or any conventional interpretation of legacy. It was about securing Susanna's freedom. Freedom from a fraudulent marriage, from medical gaslighting, from the social and legal structures that allowed men like Gideon to destroy women's lives with impunity. And the 1-year deadline wasn't arbitrary. It was enough time for Gideon to commit himself fully to his conspiracy, to create a documented trail of deception that would trigger the fraud provision in the will. Beatrice had set him up perfectly, offering just enough apparent vulnerability in the legacy clause to make him confident, while providing Susanna the tools and time to gather irrefutable proof of his crimes. The sound of the conservatory door opening pulled Susanna from her thoughts. She quickly blotted the paper and slipped it into her writing desk, then arranged herself at the piano as though she had been practicing scales. Lydia appeared in the doorway of the music room moments later, her expression carefully arranged into sisterly concern. "Susanna, I didn't know you'd returned. I came to call on Gideon about some estate business, and when I heard piano music, I thought perhaps you were feeling better." "Much better, thank you." Susanna played a simple melody, her fingers moving over the keys with a steadiness that belied the rage simmering beneath her composed exterior. The time at the summer estate was restorative. Mother's presence still lingers there, you know. It's almost as though she's still guiding me. Something flickered in Lydia's eyes. Uncertainty, perhaps, or suspicion. How lovely. And did you find anything interesting among her effects? Just memories. Susanna smiled, the same serene smile she had perfected over 3 years of hiding her true thoughts. Mother was sentimental about some things. I found old letters, photographs, little mementos. Nothing of consequence. Well, that's probably for the best. Dwelling on the past can be unhealthy for someone in your delicate condition. Lydia moved into the room, her silk skirts rustling with each step. Gideon and I were just discussing how important it is that you rest, that you don't overtax yourself with complicated decisions. How thoughtful of you both. Susanna transitioned into a different melody, something melancholy and haunting. I'm fortunate to have such caring family. Lydia lingered a moment longer, clearly trying to assess whether Susanna suspected anything. But Susanna had learned from the best, from Beatrice, who had hidden her own investigation for months, and from Gideon himself, who had taught her through negative example how to wear a mask in public while pursuing ruthless objectives in private. I should be going, Lydia finally said. Do take care of yourself, sister. We'll speak again soon, I'm sure. I look forward to it. After Lydia departed, Susanna continued playing until she heard Gideon's footsteps in the hall, moving toward his study. Only then did she stop, sitting in silence at the piano while the final notes faded into air. She had 9 months to secure her legacy, 9 months to dismantle the conspiracy that sought to destroy her, 9 months to transform from victim into victor. But now she had weapons she hadn't possessed before. The truth about her health, evidence of financial fraud, and most devastatingly the testimony she had just overheard of Gideon and Lydia planning her imprisonment. Her mother's masterstroke was beginning to reveal its full genius. And Susanna Thorne, who had spent 3 years being defined by what she supposedly lacked, was about to show Gideon and Lydia exactly what a Langdon woman possessed when she finally decided to grow thorns. The war had begun in earnest, and this time, Susanna intended to win. The letter arrived 2 days after Susanna had overheard the conservatory conspiracy, delivered in a plain envelope with no return address. Inside was a single sentence in handwriting she didn't recognize. Dr. Sarah Westfield will be in London for 3 days beginning Thursday next. She remembers her promise to Mrs. Langdon and remains available to fulfill it. Susanna read the message 3 times before understanding settled over her. This was part of Beatrice's arrangement, the network of protection her mother had built in anticipation of exactly this situation. Dr. Westfield, the Edinburgh physician who had examined Susanna's medical history without ever meeting her, was offering a consultation that Beatrice had arranged months or perhaps years in advance. Thursday was 4 days away. 4 days to arrange a trip to London without arousing Gideon's suspicion, to slip away from his increasingly watchful presence, and obtain the independent medical assessment that would either confirm or destroy the narrative that had defined her for 3 years. The opportunity presented itself that very evening when Gideon announced he would be travelling to visit his family estate in Cornwall, a property he rarely mentioned and had never taken Susanna to visit. Business matters that require my personal attention, he explained over dinner, his pocket watch already in hand as though calculating the hours until departure. I'll be gone approximately 1 week. So long? Susanna kept her voice neutral, her expression showing only mild concern at being left alone. The matters are complex. Legal issues regarding the estate that have been pending for some time. He studied her across the table, and she had the distinct impression he was measuring her reaction for signs of the instability he and Lydia were working so hard to construct. Will you manage in my absence? I could ask your sister to stay with you if you're feeling anxious. That won't be necessary. I'm quite capable of managing the household for a week. Susanna paused, then added with calculated hesitation, though I had been thinking of visiting London myself. There are modistes who carry mourning clothes more appropriate to my circumstances. What I have is designed for a matron, not—" She let the sentence trail off, allowing him to fill in the painful blank. Not a mother, never a mother, always barren and incomplete. Gideon's expression softened into something that might have been genuine sympathy if she hadn't known the truth of his character. "Of course, you should have proper attire. Take whatever time you need in London. Perhaps the change of scenery will do you good." "Perhaps." Susanna lowered her eyes, playing the docile wife, accepting her husband's generous permission for the smallest of freedoms. He left for Cornwall the following morning, and Susanna immediately set her own plans in motion. She sent word to Mrs. Brennan that she would be travelling to London for several days, then penned a carefully worded response to the mysterious letter, indicating she would be available for Dr. Westfield's consultation on Friday morning. The reply came within hours, delivered by the same unmarked messenger. An address in Bloomsbury. A time, 10 o'clock, and a single line of instruction: "Come alone. Tell no one." Susanna departed for London on Thursday afternoon, travelling in a hired carriage rather than the family coach to maintain discretion. She had told the household staff she was visiting modistes and would be staying at the Langdon family's London townhouse, which had been closed since Beatrice's death, but was still maintained by a skeleton staff. The townhouse felt haunted when she arrived, filled with her mother's presence in every carefully chosen furnishing and strategic placement of mirrors to maximize light. The housekeeper, an elderly woman named Mrs. Chappell, who had served Beatrice for decades, greeted Susanna with an embrace that spoke of genuine affection. "It's good to see you here, Miss Susanna. Your mother would be pleased." She still used Susanna's maiden name, a small rebellion against the marriage that had diminished rather than elevated Beatrice's daughter. "I received word you'd be coming. Your room is prepared, and I've taken the liberty of having a light supper sent up. You look as though you could use a good meal and a proper night's rest." Susanna accepted both gratefully, too nervous about the following day's appointment to do more than pick at the food. She spent the evening in her mother's private sitting room, surrounded by books and correspondence that revealed the full scope of Beatrice's intellectual life. Her mother had been involved in railway investments, had corresponded with scientists and political reformers, had built an empire of influence that extended far beyond the traditional feminine sphere of household management, and she had used that empire to protect her daughter, even from beyond death. Sleep came fitfully, and Susanna rose before dawn, too anxious to remain in bed. She dressed carefully in her most modest gown, pinning her red hair into a tight bun that made her look older, more serious. This was not a social call. This was the moment when 3 years of lies would either be confirmed or shattered. The address in Bloomsbury turned out to be a respectable medical practice in a row of similar buildings. A small brass plaque beside the door read, "Dr. S. Westfield, physician," with no other indication that this was the office of a woman who had dared to enter a profession that actively worked to exclude her gender. Susanna knocked, and the door was opened immediately by a woman of perhaps 45, with iron-grey hair pulled back severely and intelligent dark eyes that assessed Susanna in a single comprehensive glance. "Mrs. Vance, please, come in quickly." Dr. Westfield ushered her into a small but immaculately organized office, closing the door and drawing the curtains with efficient movements. "Forgive the secrecy, but your mother was quite specific that these consultations should be conducted with absolute discretion." "Consultations? More than one?" "I examined you once before, though you weren't aware of it at the time." Dr. Westfield gestured to a chair and settled behind her desk. "2 years ago, your mother arranged for me to be present at a social gathering you attended. I observed you carefully throughout the evening, noting your physical presentation, your movements, any signs that might indicate the condition Dr. Whitmore had diagnosed." Susanna felt a chill run through her. "You were spying on me?" I was conducting a medical assessment at your mother's request, because she suspected Dr. Whitmore's diagnosis was fraudulent. Westfield's tone was matter-of-fact, neither apologetic nor defensive. Mrs. Langdon was a woman of remarkable insight. She recognized that a diagnosis of barrenness can be used as a weapon against women, particularly when made by physicians more interested in supporting a husband's narrative than discovering medical truth. And what did you observe? A healthy young woman showing no physical signs of reproductive dysfunction. Good color, appropriate weight. No indication of the various conditions that can prevent conception. Westfield opened a file on her desk, revealing pages of notes in precise handwriting. But observation alone isn't sufficient for a definitive assessment. That's why your mother arranged for this consultation, to be conducted when you were ready to seek the truth yourself. I'm ready now. Susanna's voice was steady despite the trembling in her hands. I need to know, am I truly barren, or has this all been a lie? That's what we're here to determine. Westfield stood, moving toward a door that led to what was clearly an examination room. I'll need to conduct a thorough physical assessment. It won't be pleasant. Medical examinations rarely are. But I promise you two things. First, I will be honest about what I find, whether it supports or contradicts Dr. Whitmore's conclusions. Second, I will explain everything I'm doing and why, so you understand the medical reasoning rather than simply accepting my authority. The examination took nearly an hour and was indeed unpleasant, though Dr. Westfield's clinical efficiency and clear explanations made it less degrading than the examinations Susanna had endured with Dr. Whitmore. Throughout the process, Westfield described what she was checking for, what normal presentation looked like, what signs might indicate various conditions. When it was finally finished and Susanna was dressed again, she sat across from Dr. Westfield with her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear her own thoughts. You are not barren. Westfield delivered the verdict with absolute certainty. Your reproductive organs are healthy and normal. Your monthly cycles, based on the history you've provided, are regular and consistent with normal ovulatory function. There is no physical reason why you should be unable to conceive. The room seemed to tilt around Susanna. She had expected this answer, had read it in her mother's journals, had known intellectually that Dr. Whitmore's diagnosis was fabricated, but hearing it confirmed by an independent physician made it devastatingly, irrevocably real. Then why? Her voice emerged as barely a whisper. Why did Dr. Whitmore say I was? I can't speak to his motivations with certainty, but I can tell you that his diagnosis was medically unsupported. Westfield pulled out another document from her file. Your mother provided me with copies of Whitmore's examination notes. They're remarkably vague, citing signs consistent with uterine deficiency without specifying what those signs were. No measurements, no specific observations, just broad assertions that would be difficult to either prove or disprove. Because they were lies, the words tasted bitter, or because they were conclusions suggested by someone else and accepted without proper verification. Westfield's expression hardened. I've seen this pattern before, Mrs. Vance. A husband who wants to blame his wife for the absence of children, either to hide his own infertility or to establish grounds for annulment. A compliant physician who values a wealthy patient's patronage over medical ethics, and a woman who has been trained by society to accept male authority regarding her own body. Susanna thought of Gideon in the examination room with her, his presence during those intimate assessments that she had assumed was appropriate. How many of Whitmore's observations had actually been Gideon's suggestions, planted before the physician ever examined her? My mother suspected my husband was the infertile one. She did more than suspect. Westfield pulled out yet another document. She hired investigators who discovered that Mr. Vance suffered from mumps in his late teens, a severe case that resulted in orchitis, inflammation of the testes. It's a known cause of male infertility, though not always discussed openly because it challenges assumptions about masculine virility. He never told me. He never mentioned being ill. Why would he, when it was so much easier to blame you? Westfield's voice carried an edge of anger that seemed professional rather than personal. The fury of a physician witnessing her profession's ethics violated. Your mother's investigation revealed that Mr. Vance was aware of his own infertility before your marriage. He needed a wife from a wealthy family, preferably one who could be convinced she was the defective party. Susanna absorbed this final piece of the puzzle, understanding at last the full scope of Gideon's deception. He had courted her knowing he could never give her children, had married her for the Langdon fortune, and had then systematically destroyed her confidence to maintain control. The barrenness diagnosis wasn't a medical mistake. It was a calculated strategy. I have something for you. Westfield opened a locked drawer in her desk and withdrew a sealed envelope. Your mother left this in my keeping, with instructions to give it to you only after I had completed my examination, and you knew the truth. Susanna accepted the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a letter in Beatrice's distinctive script, dated just weeks before her death. My dearest Susanna, it began. If you are reading this, Dr. Westfield has confirmed what I have known for 2 years. You are healthy, whole, and capable of bearing children. The barrenness you have carried as shame was never yours to bear. It was a lie, created by a man who needed you to doubt yourself, to believe you were broken, so that you would never question his authority or his motives. I allowed that lie to persist not out of cruelty, but because I understood that you needed to discover the truth yourself in your own time, when you were strong enough to wield it as a weapon. That time is now. You have the medical evidence to destroy Gideon's narrative. You have proof of Dr. Whitmore's complicity in fraud, and you have the will's provision that disinherits anyone who has deceived others regarding your health. The trap is set. All you must do now is spring it. But remember, my darling girl, the greatest victory is not in punishing those who betrayed you, but in reclaiming the life they tried to steal. You are not barren. You are not broken. You are a Langdon, and you are free. Use that freedom wisely. Your loving mother, Beatrice. Susanna read the letter twice, tears streaming down her face unchecked. Dr. Westfield quietly poured her a glass of water and waited, allowing the emotional storm to pass without comment or platitude. What do I do now? Susanna finally asked, her voice raw. That depends on what you want. Westfield settled back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. You have evidence that your husband conspired to have you diagnosed as barren when you are not. That's grounds for annulment based on fraud, if you wish to pursue that route. You also have evidence that violates the terms of your mother's will, which would trigger the disinheritance provision. He's planning to have me declared mentally incompetent and confined to an asylum. The words tumbled out, and Susanna found herself explaining everything: the overheard conspiracy, Lydia's involvement, the planned division of the Langdon fortune. Westfield's expression grew darker with each revelation. Then you have even less time than I thought. If he moves forward with that plan before you expose his fraud, it becomes much more difficult to challenge. A woman confined to an asylum has limited legal standing to contest her commitment. So I need to act first. You need to act strategically. Westfield pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began writing with swift, decisive strokes. I'll provide you with a formal medical assessment documenting your health and explicitly contradicting Dr. Whitmore's diagnosis. This, combined with the evidence your mother gathered, should be sufficient to trigger the will's fraud provision and protect you from any competency proceedings. But Gideon has Dr. Whitmore prepared to testify to my mental instability. My sister will support his claims. It becomes my word against theirs, and society will believe the husband and physician over the supposedly unstable wife. Which is why you don't confront them privately. You expose them publicly, in a setting where their lies can be immediately challenged with evidence. Westfield signed her name to the document with a flourish. Your mother's will was read by a solicitor with witnesses present. The fraud provision should be triggered in the same formal manner, with legal representation and documentation that cannot be dismissed or ignored. Susanna felt something shift inside her, the final transformation from victim to strategist. Her mother had not just given her evidence. She had taught her, through the structure of the will itself, how to use that evidence effectively. Beatrice had created a legal framework that required public proceedings, witnesses, documentation. A trap that would snap shut in front of observers who could not be swayed by Gideon's charm or intimidated by his authority. I need to speak with Mr. Pemberton. You need to speak with Mr. Pemberton and ensure he understands that your husband is in violation of the will's provisions. Once that's established, Gideon loses all claim to the inheritance, and his motivation for having you declared incompetent evaporates. Westfield handed her the completed medical assessment. This is your ammunition. Use it wisely. Susanna accepted the document, holding it with the same reverent care she had shown Beatrice's final letter. My mother trusted you. Your mother was one of the most remarkable women I've ever known. She understood that women's bodies are battlegrounds in ways men will never fully comprehend. Every diagnosis, every pronouncement, every limitation placed on us must be questioned, verified, challenged. She fought that battle for you, because she knew you weren't yet strong enough to fight it yourself. Westfield stood, extending her hand. But you're strong enough now, Mrs. Vance. Or should I say, Miss Langdon. Susanna shook the physician's hand, feeling the weight of the past 3 years beginning to lift. Susanna Thorne. My mother always called me by my full name. Then Susanna Thorne it is. Go forth and reclaim what was stolen from you, not just the fortune but your sense of self, your bodily autonomy, your future. Westfield smiled, a fierce expression of professional satisfaction. And when Gideon Vance asks how this happened, tell him a woman physician exposed his lies. Let that bitter pill be part of his punishment. Susanna left the Bloomsbury office with her reticule heavy with evidence and her spine straight with newfound purpose. She was not barren, she was not broken, she was not the empty, defective creature Gideon had spent 3 years convincing her she was. She was Susanna Langdon Thorne, daughter of Beatrice Langdon, heir to a fortune, and possessor of truths that would destroy the men and women who had conspired against her. The legacy clause suddenly made perfect sense. To secure her legacy, she didn't need to bear a child or build a business. She needed to reclaim herself, to shed the false diagnosis, the fraudulent marriage, the psychological abuse that had nearly convinced her she was worthless. And she needed to do it within the 9 months that remained before the deadline, ensuring that when the year was complete, she stood free and vindicated. The war was no longer coming. It had arrived, and Susanna finally had the weapons to win it. Susanna returned from London transformed, though she was careful to let that transformation show only in calculated increments. The evidence from Dr. Westfield was secured in her private escritoire alongside Beatrice's journals and the documentation of payments to Dr. Whitmore. She had everything needed to spring the trap, but timing, as her mother had taught her, was everything. Gideon arrived back from Cornwall 3 days after her return, his mood buoyant in a way that made Susanna's skin crawl. He found her in the morning room, ostensibly reviewing household accounts, though she was actually studying the will's precise language regarding the fraud provision. "You're looking well," he observed, checking his pocket watch with that habitual gesture that now seemed almost comforting in its predictability. "London agreed with you. It was restorative." Susanna kept her eyes on the ledger, her voice carefully modulated to suggest quiet resignation rather than the fierce clarity that had settled over her since Dr. Westfield's examination. "I ordered new mourning clothes, more appropriate to my circumstances." She let the pause speak volumes, watched him register what she was implying, acceptance finally of her childless state, of her position as a permanent disappointment. "That's sensible of you." He moved closer, and she could feel him studying her, trying to assess whether her compliance was genuine or performance. "I've been thinking during my time away about our situation, about the future. I believe it's time we had an honest conversation about what's best for both of us." "An honest conversation?" Susanna looked up, meeting his eyes with an expression of weary understanding. "You want to discuss the annulment?" Gideon had the grace to look momentarily uncomfortable, though whether from genuine feeling or practiced theatrics, she could no longer tell. "You know it's been on my mind. We've tried, Susanna. For 3 years we've tried to make this marriage what it should be. But given your condition, given the strain it places on us both, you think it would be kinder to end it." She completed his thought, watching relief flicker across his features at her apparent acquiescence. "Not kinder, more honest. You deserve the opportunity to live without the constant reminder of what you cannot achieve, and I—" He paused, the picture of reluctant duty. "I have obligations to my family line, responsibilities that require an heir." Susanna set down her pen with deliberate care. "When were you planning to make the announcement?" "I thought perhaps in 2 weeks, at the Ashford ball. A public setting, but one where our friends and family could offer immediate support." His hand moved to his pocket watch again, clicking it open and shut with nervous energy. "Of course, I would ensure you're provided for. The annulment settlement would be generous." "How generous?" The question was calculated to make him think she was already negotiating terms of surrender rather than planning his destruction. "We can discuss specifics with the solicitors, but I'm thinking an annual income that would allow you to live comfortably, perhaps at the Bath property your mother left to Lydia. Your sister has mentioned she would be willing to share it, to ensure you're not alone." Of course, Lydia had offered. The conspiracy was proceeding exactly as Susanna had overheard in the conservatory: annulment, settlement, and her quiet exile to Bath under her sister's watchful supervision. What they hadn't planned for was Susanna's discovery of the truth, or her willingness to weaponize it. "That's very thoughtful," Susanna said quietly. "I'll need some time to adjust to the idea, of course. But I appreciate your honesty." Gideon's relief was palpable. "I'm glad you're being reasonable about this. I was concerned you might be difficult, given the emotional strain you've been under." "What would be the point of being difficult?" Susanna returned her attention to the ledger, dismissing him with the gesture. "We both know what I am, what I lack. Fighting against reality would only make me appear more unstable than I already seem." She felt his attention sharpen at that last word, unstable. It was a carefully baited hook, suggesting she was aware of how others perceived her, perhaps even accepting of the narrative he and Lydia were constructing. "You're not unstable, Susanna. You're simply fragile, under considerable strain, which is why this solution is best for both of us." He left her then, satisfied that the difficult conversation had gone better than expected. Susanna waited until his footsteps faded before allowing herself a small, cold smile. Let him think her compliant, let him move forward with his plans for the Ashford ball, gathering witnesses for what he believed would be the sympathetic announcement of an unavoidable annulment. She had 2 weeks to complete the trap. The first step was Lydia. Her sister arrived the following afternoon, summoned by a carefully worded note suggesting Susanna needed sisterly support during a difficult time. Lydia swept into the drawing room in a cloud of rose-colored silk, still technically mourning, but the shade chosen to flatter rather than observe propriety. "Darling, I came as soon as I received your note." Lydia embraced her with performative warmth, the fan already appearing in her hand. "Gideon mentioned you'd had a conversation about the future. How are you managing?" Susanna allowed herself to look smaller, more vulnerable than she'd appeared in weeks. She had dressed in her most matronly gown, had pulled her hair back so tightly it created the illusion of premature aging. "I'm trying to accept what cannot be changed." "Oh, sweetheart." Lydia settled onto the settee, arranging her skirts with practiced grace. "I know this must be devastating, but truly, it may be for the best. You've suffered enough, trying to be something you simply cannot be." "I saw another physician while I was in London." Susanna delivered the lie with perfect timing, watching her sister's expression shift from sympathy to sharp interest. "Did you? What kind of physician?" "A specialist. One who has made particular study of female disorders." Susanna looked down at her hands, projecting shame and resignation. "I thought perhaps Dr. Whitmore had been mistaken, that there might be some treatment, some hope." But this physician was even more definitive in his assessment. The pronoun was deliberate, his rather than her, because Lydia would never suspect a woman physician, would never imagine Susanna seeking care outside the male medical establishment that had already condemned her. More definitive? Lydia leaned forward, the fan moving in slow, measured rhythm. "What did he say? What did?" "That the condition is not only permanent but likely to worsen with age, that even if by some miracle conception were to occur, my body lacks the capacity to carry a child to term." Susanna forced tears into her eyes, not difficult given the years of shame she had carried based on exactly these kinds of lies. "He said I should consider myself fortunate that Gideon has been as patient as he has, that most men would have sought annulment years ago." She watched Lydia absorb this fabrication, saw the calculation behind her sister's sympathetic expression. This was exactly what the conspiracy required. Medical confirmation that Susanna was not only barren but irredeemably so, removing any lingering doubt that might complicate the annulment proceedings. "Did this physician provide documentation of his findings?" Lydia's question was carefully casual, but Susanna heard the eagerness beneath it. "He said he would send a formal assessment to Dr. Whitmore for the medical records." Another lie, smooth as silk. Professional courtesy between physicians, he called it. "Of course." Lydia reached across to pat Susanna's hand, a gesture of comfort that felt more like a predator's caress. "I know this is painful to hear, but at least now you have certainty. No more hoping for miracles that will never come. You can begin to plan for a different kind of future." "In Bath, you mean?" Susanna met her sister's eyes, letting despair show rather than the contempt she actually felt. "Gideon mentioned you might be willing to share Mother's property there." "More than willing. I think it would be good for you, being away from London society, away from the constant reminders of what might have been. We could keep each other company, you and I. You could help with my children. Be the devoted aunt, since you cannot be a mother yourself." The cruelty of the offer was breathtaking. Susanna exiled to Bath, serving as unpaid nursemaid to Lydia's children, a living reminder of her own supposed failure. And Lydia delivered it with a smile, as though offering a kindness rather than a prison. "That's very generous of you." Susanna's voice carried just the right note of grateful resignation. "Family takes care of family." Lydia stood, apparently satisfied that Susanna was thoroughly defeated. "Now, about the Ashford ball. Gideon is planning to make the announcement there, and I think it's important that you attend. Show society that this is a mutual decision made with dignity, not a scandal. You want me there when he announces our marriage is ending? I want you there showing grace and acceptance. It will go much easier for you if society sees you handling this with composure rather than hysterics." Lydia's fan snapped open, concealing the lower half of her face. "Wear something appropriate, nothing too ornamental. You want to appear dignified but not defiant, accepting your circumstances rather than railing against them." "I understand." Susanna rose as well, walking her sister to the door. "Thank you for coming, Lydia, for supporting me through this." "Always, darling. That's what sisters do." After Lydia departed, Susanna allowed herself a moment of bitter satisfaction. The bait had been taken perfectly. Lydia would report to Gideon that Susanna had seen another physician who had confirmed the barrenness diagnosis with even more damning specificity. They would believe she was completely defeated, resigned to exile in Bath, willing to appear at the Ashford ball as the compliant soon-to-be former wife, accepting her fate with dignity. They had no idea she was planning to appear at that ball, with very different intentions. The following week passed in careful preparation. Susanna met privately with Mr. Pemberton, the solicitor who had read Beatrice's will. She presented him with Dr. Westfield's medical assessment, the documentation of payments from Gideon to Dr. Whitmore, and her mother's journals detailing the investigation Beatrice had conducted. Pemberton studied the evidence with the careful attention of a man who had seen too many family fortunes destroyed by deception to be easily shocked. "This is damning, Mrs. Vance. If these documents are authentic, and I have no reason to doubt they are, given that several came from your mother's own hand, then Mr. Vance has clearly violated the will's fraud provision. He has also conspired with my sister to have me declared mentally incompetent so he can control the inheritance." Susanna provided him with the written testimony she had prepared, documenting the overheard conversation in the conservatory. That would constitute an even more serious violation. Pemberton set down the papers and regarded her with something approaching respect. "You've been more thorough than I would have expected. Your mother would be proud. My mother prepared me for this, though I didn't understand it at the time." Susanna leaned forward, her voice steady with purpose. "Mr. Vance is planning to announce our annulment at the Ashford ball in 1 week. He believes I will attend meekly, accepting my fate. Instead, I want to trigger the will's fraud provision publicly, in front of the witnesses he has gathered to observe my humiliation." Pemberton was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "It would be effective. Dramatic, certainly, and there would be social consequences for everyone involved. Are you prepared for that?" "I'm prepared to stop being defined by lies." Susanna met his eyes. "My mother's will gave me 1 year to secure my legacy. I believe this is what she meant, not bearing a child or building a business, but reclaiming the truth about who I am and exposing those who conspired to destroy me." "Then I'll make the necessary arrangements. The will's executors will need to be present, along with witnesses who can testify to the proper execution of the fraud provision." Pemberton pulled out his calendar, making notes with precise strokes. "The Ashford ball it is. I assume you'll want the revelation to occur after Mr. Vance has committed himself publicly to the annulment?" "After he's announced it, but before he can complete the legal proceedings. I want him to experience the same trap my mother set, believing he's won, only to discover he's destroyed himself. Over the next week, Susanna transformed her wardrobe and her demeanor in subtle increments. She appeared increasingly resigned to Gideon, more openly defeated when he discussed the annulment arrangements. She accepted Lydia's visits with grateful passivity, listening to her sister's advice about how to comport herself at the ball, what to say when sympathetic friends offered their condolences on the end of her marriage, and all the while she was shedding the stoic shell that had protected her through 3 years of abuse. Not publicly, not yet, but in the privacy of her rooms, she practiced holding herself differently, standing taller, meeting her own eyes in the mirror without flinching, seeing herself not as the barren failure Gideon had created, but as the Langdon woman Beatrice had raised. The night before the ball, she opened her mother's final letter one more time, reading the words that had become her armor. "You are not barren, you are not broken. You are a Langdon, and you are free." Tomorrow, she would prove it. Tomorrow, Gideon Vance would stand before London society and announce the annulment of his marriage to the supposedly barren, mentally fragile Susanna Thorne. He would paint himself as the dutiful husband making a difficult but necessary choice, expecting sympathy and understanding. Instead, he would trigger his own destruction. The stoic shell was cracking, piece by piece, and beneath it, finally, Susanna Thorne was blooming with thorns sharp enough to draw blood. The Ashford ball would not be a scene of her humiliation. It would be the theatre of her triumph, orchestrated by a dead woman's brilliant trap, and executed by the daughter who had finally learned to wield the weapons she'd been given. Susanna dressed for bed that night without the weight of shame she had carried for 3 years. She was not perfect, would never be the ornamental, compliant wife society expected. But she was real, and she was true, and she was about to reclaim everything that had been stolen through lies. Let Gideon check his pocket watch tomorrow. Let him count down the minutes to what he believed would be his victory. Time, it turned out, was on Susanna's side after all. The Ashford ballroom glittered with 1,000 candles reflected in crystal chandeliers, their light casting dancing shadows across the assembled elite of London society. Susanna arrived precisely at 9 o'clock, dressed not in the subdued, matronly gown Lydia had suggested, but in deep emerald silk that brought out the green of her eyes and complemented the rich auburn of her hair. She had abandoned the tight, punishing bun for a softer arrangement that framed her face, and she wore the Langdon signet ring openly on her right hand, the thornless rose gleaming in the candlelight. She saw Gideon's expression shift when he spotted her across the room. Confusion, then irritation, then a flash of something that might have been concern. This was not the defeated, compliant wife he had expected. This was a woman who had stopped apologizing for occupying space. Lydia approached first, her fan already deployed to hide her expression of alarm. "Susanna, what are you wearing?" "I specifically said something modest, something that wouldn't draw attention." "Did you?" Susanna met her sister's eyes with a calm that bordered on serene. "I must have misunderstood. I thought tonight was about dignity, and I've always felt dignified in Emerald." Before Lydia could respond, Gideon materialized at Susanna's elbow, his hand closing around her arm with pressure just shy of painful. "A word, wife, in private." "I don't think that will be necessary." Susanna extracted her arm with deliberate grace. "Anything you wish to say to me can be said here, among our friends and family." His jaw tightened, and she saw him reach automatically for his pocket watch before remembering the formal setting. "You're making a scene." "Am I?" "I've simply arrived at a ball I was invited to attend, wearing a gown appropriate to the occasion. If that constitutes a scene, the fault lies with the observers, not with me." She moved past him into the ballroom proper, acutely aware of the eyes following her. This was not the Susanna Thorne London society knew, the quiet, apologetic woman who seemed to shrink into herself at social gatherings. This was someone new, or perhaps someone very old, resurrected from the ashes of 3 years of systematic diminishment. Mr. Pemberton stood near the refreshment table, his presence unremarkable to those who didn't know to look for him. Beside him were 2 other gentlemen Susanna recognized from the will reading, the executors her mother had appointed to ensure the document's provisions were carried out precisely. Their presence would seem coincidental to casual observers, 3 older men attending a society ball. Only Susanna and Pemberton knew they were witnesses positioned for what was coming. The evening proceeded with agonizing slowness. Susanna danced when asked, conversed with acquaintances, accepted condolences about her mother's death with appropriate gravity. All the while she felt Gideon's attention on her like a physical weight, could sense him recalculating his strategy, trying to determine what had changed and how to regain control. At 10:30, Lord Ashford called for attention, his voice carrying across the ballroom as the musicians fell silent. "Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Gideon Vance has asked for a moment of your attention. A personal announcement regarding matters of some delicacy." This was it. The moment Gideon had been planning, the public declaration that would establish the narrative of mutual, dignified separation before the legal proceedings began. Susanna positioned herself where she could see his face clearly, where the executors and Pemberton had unobstructed views of the proceedings. Gideon stepped forward, his expression arranged into somber dignity. He had dressed impeccably for this performance, every detail calculated to present the image of a responsible man, making difficult but necessary choices. "My friends," he began, his voice carrying just the right note of reluctant duty, "I come before you tonight to share news that brings me great personal sadness. After 3 years of marriage, my wife and I have reached the painful conclusion that our union cannot continue as we had hoped." A murmur rippled through the assembled guests. Susanna stood perfectly still, her expression neutral, giving Gideon no reaction to work with. "Those close to our family know that my dear wife has struggled with certain limitations, medical conditions that have prevented us from achieving the blessed state of parenthood that we both so desperately desired." He paused, allowing sympathy to build among the listeners. "We have consulted numerous physicians, sought every possible treatment, but the conclusion remains unchanged. Mrs. Vance is, through no fault of her own, unable to bear children." Susanna watched him build the lie, brick by careful brick. Around her, she could feel the assembled guests' reactions, the pitying looks directed her way, the approving nods for Gideon's apparent sensitivity in handling such a delicate matter. "Given this reality, and given my family's need for an heir, we have mutually agreed that an annulment is the most honest and honorable path forward." Gideon's hand moved to his pocket watch, that unconscious gesture of a man confident in his control of time and circumstances. "I want to be clear that Mrs. Vance has my complete support and my enduring respect. She will be provided for generously, and I hope society will treat her with the compassion and dignity she deserves." It was a masterful performance. He had positioned himself as both dutiful and compassionate, had framed the annulment as a mutual decision made with Susanna's best interests at heart. The assembled guests were already nodding, already accepting the narrative he had constructed. Susanna let the silence stretch for 1 beat, then 2, then 3. She watched Gideon's expression shift to relief, to satisfaction, to the beginning of triumph. Then she stepped forward. "How kind of you, husband, to be so concerned with my dignity." Her voice carried clearly across the now silent ballroom, drawing every eye to her. "Though I must confess some confusion about the medical conditions you've referenced. Perhaps you could be more specific, for the benefit of our friends who might misunderstand the situation. Gideon's eyes narrowed. Susanna, this isn't the time, isn't it? She moved closer to him, her posture straight, her voice steady. You've just announced to London society that I am barren, that multiple physicians have confirmed this diagnosis, that our marriage must end because I cannot provide you with an heir. Surely such serious medical claims deserve proper documentation. The medical details are private, as they should be. I mentioned them only to ensure people understood the necessity of our decision. His tone sharpened, irritation bleeding through the veneer of compassion. Private. Yes, I see. Susanna turned to address the assembled guests directly. I've spent 3 years accepting the privacy of medical consultations, trusting the physicians my husband selected, believing the diagnoses I was never allowed to see documented. But privacy, I've discovered, can be used to hide lies as easily as it protects dignity. A shocked murmur ran through the crowd. Lydia materialized at the edge of Susanna's vision, her fan moving in agitated rhythm, clearly trying to determine how to intervene. You're overwrought, Gideon said, his voice taking on that patient, condescending tone he used when positioning her as emotionally unstable. The stress of this announcement has clearly affected your judgment. Perhaps we should retire to somewhere more private. No! The word rang out with absolute finality. I'm done with privacy. I'm done with accepting authority without verification. I'm done with being defined by lies. She reached into her reticule and withdrew the folded documents she had carried all evening. Dr. Westfield's medical assessment, the payment records, her mother's journals. I have here a medical evaluation conducted by Dr. Sarah Westfield of Edinburgh, a physician of impeccable credentials and no connection to my husband. Her assessment, based on thorough examination, is that I am in perfect health and fully capable of bearing children. The murmurs grew louder. Gideon's face flushed dark red. That's absurd. Dr. Whitmore, our family physician for years, has documented. Dr. Whitmore, who received substantial payments from you immediately prior to each diagnosis of my supposed barrenness. Susanna held up the financial records. Payments documented in these bank transfers, which my late mother discovered during her own investigation of my medical situation. How dare you? Gideon stepped toward her, his carefully maintained composure cracking. Mr. Pemberton moved forward then, his presence commanding despite his age. Mr. Vance, I believe this matter requires formal legal attention. As executor of Mrs. Beatrice Langdon's will, I must inform you that accusations of medical fraud regarding Mrs. Vance's health trigger specific provisions of that document. This is a private family matter, Gideon snapped, his attention torn between Susanna and the solicitor. It has nothing to do with Beatrice Langdon's will. On the contrary, Pemberton's voice carried the weight of legal authority. The will explicitly states that any family member found to have engaged in fraud or deception regarding Susanna Langdon Thorne's health or capacity shall be immediately and permanently disinherited from any benefit of the estate. The ballroom had gone completely silent now, every guest transfixed by the spectacle unfolding before them. This was no longer a dignified announcement of mutual separation. This was an accusation of conspiracy, of fraud, of systematic abuse. You're claiming I fabricated medical diagnoses? Gideon's voice rose, the careful control abandoning him entirely. That I bribed physicians? Based on what? The word of some woman doctor in Edinburgh and the paranoid fantasies of a dying old woman? Based on 3 years of documented evidence. Susanna's voice remained calm, a stark contrast to his rising fury. Evidence my mother collected because she suspected exactly what I have now confirmed. That you married me for the Langdon fortune. that you fabricated the diagnosis of barrenness to undermine my confidence and establish grounds for eventual annulment, and that you conspired with Dr. Whitmore to create medical documentation supporting your lies. This is insane. You're insane, just as I told Lydia." He stopped abruptly, realizing his mistake. "Just as you told Lydia," Susanna repeated softly. "My sister, with whom you've been coordinating your strategy. Shall I share with our assembled friends what I overheard you discussing in the conservatory 3 weeks ago? The plan to have me declared mentally incompetent and confined to an asylum while you and Lydia divided my inheritance." Lydia had gone pale, her fan frozen in mid-movement. Gideon's fury was now visible to everyone in the ballroom. The handsome mask had fallen away to reveal the cold, calculating man beneath. "You spied on a private conversation. You twisted innocent discussion into conspiracy." His hand grabbed for her arm again, but this time Pemberton intervened physically, stepping between them. "Mr. Vance, you need to control yourself. You're in the presence of witnesses, and your behavior is being noted by the will's executors." The will, the damned will. Gideon's voice had risen to a shout. "That manipulative document was designed to trap me, to prevent me from claiming what should rightfully be mine. I married that defective woman. I endured 3 years of her failure, and I'm entitled to compensation for my patience." The words hung in the air, damning and irretrievable. He had just admitted before dozens of witnesses that he had married Susanna for the inheritance, that he viewed her as defective property, that he believed himself entitled to the Langdon fortune despite having no legitimate claim to it. "Thank you for that clarity," Pemberton said dryly. He turned to the 2 other executors who had moved closer during the confrontation. "Gentlemen, I believe we have sufficient evidence and testimony to invoke the will's fraud provision. Mr. Vance has admitted to viewing the marriage as a transaction for financial gain, has been presented with evidence of medical fraud, and has demonstrated before witnesses the controlling and abusive behavior Mrs. Langdon suspected." "Agreed," said the elder of the 2 executors, a distinguished gentleman with silver hair. "The provision is clear. Any family member engaged in fraud regarding Susanna Thorne's health or capacity is to be immediately disinherited." "This is a farce!" Gideon looked around the ballroom wildly, seeking allies and finding none. Every face showed varying degrees of shock, disapproval, or fascinated horror. "You cannot disinherit me based on the lies of a barren woman and the machinations of her dead mother." "I'm not barren." Susanna's voice cut through his tirade with surgical precision. "I have independent medical verification of my perfect health. What I am is free. Free of your lies, free of your manipulation, and free of this marriage." She turned to Pemberton. "I assume the fraud provision also invalidates any claim my husband might have to the Langdon inheritance." Completely and irrevocably. Pemberton pulled out a document he had been carrying. "Furthermore, the annulment he has just publicly announced will be granted on grounds of fraud, his fraud, not yours. The medical evidence you've provided demonstrates that any failure to produce an heir lies with him, not with you, and that he knowingly misrepresented your health to society and legal authorities." "That's not true. I'm perfectly capable." Gideon stopped again, trapped by his own words. If he was capable of producing an heir, then the annulment based on Susanna's barrenness was fraudulent. If he admitted to being infertile, he confessed to the very deception that triggered the will's fraud provision. "My mother's investigation uncovered medical records indicating you suffered from mumps-related orchitis as a young man," Susanna said quietly. "A condition known to cause male infertility. You knew before our marriage that you could never give me children, yet you allowed me to carry the shame of barrenness for 3 years." The ballroom erupted in shocked conversation. This was scandal of the highest order. Medical fraud, financial conspiracy, the systematic abuse of a young wife by a fortune hunter who had manipulated everyone, including respected physicians. Gideon stood frozen, his carefully constructed world collapsing around him. His hand moved to his pocket watch, that unconscious gesture of control, but the time was no longer his to manage. Everything he had planned, every calculation he had made, had been anticipated and countered by a woman he had assumed was too damaged to fight back. "You'll pay for this," he said, his voice low and vicious. "I'll ruin you. I'll ensure every drawing room in London knows you for the vindictive, hysterical woman you are." "I think London already knows exactly who I am," Susanna replied. "And, more importantly, they now know exactly who you are." She turned to the assembled guests, her voice carrying clearly. "I apologize for disrupting this lovely ball with such unpleasant matters, but I thought it important that the truth be established publicly, given that my husband chose to make his false accusations in this same public forum. I hope you'll forgive the spectacle." Lord Ashford, who had been watching the entire proceedings with wide eyes, stepped forward. "Mrs. Vance, or should I say, Miss Thorne, you have nothing to apologize for. It takes remarkable courage to face down such deception." Other voices joined his, expressing support, outrage at Gideon's behavior, admiration for Susanna's strength. The social tide had turned completely. She was no longer the pitiable, barren wife, but the courageous woman who had exposed a conspiracy and reclaimed her dignity. Gideon looked around the ballroom one final time, seeing his reputation, his schemes, his future all crumbling to dust. Then he turned and strode toward the exit, pushing through the crowd with barely controlled violence. Lydia started to follow him, but Susanna's voice stopped her. "Sister, before you go, you should know that the will's fraud provision applies to all family members engaged in deception. Your conspiracy with Gideon to have me declared incompetent and institutionalized is documented in my testimony and witnessed by the executors. I suspect you'll find your own inheritance from Mother's estate is now in jeopardy." Lydia's face crumpled, the beautiful mask falling away to reveal the calculating, desperate woman beneath. "You would ruin your own sister?" "I would expose my own sister's attempt to ruin me. There's a difference." Susanna's voice held no malice, only cold finality. "You made your choice when you chose Gideon's conspiracy over family loyalty." Lydia fled, her silk skirts rustling with the speed of her retreat. The ballroom slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy, though the conversations were all focused on what they had just witnessed, the most dramatic public exposure of marital fraud London society had seen in decades. Pemberton approached Susanna quietly. "That was well executed. Your mother would have been proud." "My mother orchestrated all of this from beyond the grave." Susanna looked down at the documents in her hand, the evidence that had destroyed Gideon's lies and freed her from 3 years of shame. "She gave me the weapons. I simply learned to use them. What will you do now?" Susanna thought of the legacy clause, of the 1 year her mother had given her to secure her legacy. 6 months had passed since Beatrice's death. 6 months remained to fulfill whatever purpose the ambiguous language had been designed to serve. But she understood now. The legacy wasn't about producing an heir or building a business empire. It was about this, about reclaiming herself, about standing in a ballroom full of witnesses and refusing to accept lies as truth, about transformation from victim to victor. Now, Susanna smiled, feeling lighter than she had in 3 years. "Now I begin to live as I was meant to, without apology, without shame, and without anyone's permission but my own." The thornless rose had grown thorns indeed, and Susanna Thorne, no longer defined by what she lacked, was finally ready to bloom. The summer estate was silent when Susanna arrived 3 days after the Ashford ball, but it was the silence of peace rather than emptiness. The scandal had swept through London with the force of a winter storm. Every drawing room, every gentleman's club, every society gathering dissecting the extraordinary scene of Gideon Vance's public destruction and Susanna Thorne's dramatic resurrection. The newspapers had been surprisingly sympathetic, perhaps because the evidence of medical fraud was so thoroughly documented, or perhaps because society had always enjoyed watching arrogant men brought low by their own machinations. Gideon had fled London entirely, last seen boarding a ship for the continent with his remaining assets and his shattered reputation. Dr. Whitmore had been expelled from his medical society pending investigation into his ethics violations, and Lydia had retreated to Bath, her portion of Beatrice's estate frozen pending the executor's determination of her complicity in the conspiracy. Susanna had endured 3 days of visitors, well-wishers, and the suddenly interested attention of society matrons who had previously dismissed her as a disappointing failure. She had accepted their condolences and congratulations with appropriate grace, but she had felt increasingly suffocated by the attention, by the constant need to perform recovery, when what she needed was solitude to process the magnitude of what had changed. So she had come here, to the place where her mother's presence lingered most strongly, to stand in the study where Beatrice had orchestrated her posthumous masterpiece. The portrait still hung behind the desk, the hidden compartment now empty, but the painted eyes still sharp and knowing. Susanna stood before it, seeing her mother's face with new understanding. Beatrice had not been cruel in allowing the barrenness diagnosis to persist. She had been strategic. She had understood that Susanna needed to discover her own strength, needed to be tested and tempered before she could wield the power the Langdon fortune represented. "You were right," Susanna said softly to the portrait. "About everything. About Gideon, about Lydia, about me. I wasn't ready 3 years ago to see the truth. I would have dismissed your warnings as maternal interference, trusted my husband over your suspicions. You had to let me discover it myself." The painted eyes offered no response, but Susanna felt her mother's approval nonetheless. She moved to the window that overlooked the gardens, now showing the first signs of approaching winter. The roses were fading, their petals dropping to prepare for dormancy, but they would return in spring, stronger, more resilient, ready to bloom again. She had removed the tight bun on the journey from London, letting her red hair fall free around her shoulders in a way she hadn't permitted since before her marriage. Gideon had always preferred it confined, controlled, tamed into submission like everything else about her. Now she ran her fingers through it, feeling the weight and texture, reclaiming even this small physical autonomy. The Langdon signet ring caught the afternoon light, the thornless rose gleaming on her right hand. She studied it, thinking about what her mother had said during one of their final conversations. "A rose without thorns is ornamental, Susanna, pretty but purposeless." But she had grown thorns. She had learned to draw blood when necessary, to defend herself, to refuse to be plucked and placed in someone else's vase for decorative purposes. A knock at the study door interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Brennan entered with her usual practical efficiency, carrying a tea tray and a stack of correspondence. "Forgive the intrusion, Miss Susanna, but these arrived this morning. I thought you'd want to see them." Miss Susanna, not Mrs. Vance. The annulment proceedings were already underway, and the staff had seamlessly adjusted to addressing her by her maiden name, erasing Gideon from her identity as thoroughly as Beatrice's will had erased him from her fortune. "Thank you, Mrs. Brennan." Susanna accepted the letters, noting that several bore the seals of solicitors and investment firms. "How are the staff managing with all the recent changes?" "Better than you might think." Your mother hired people who valued integrity over social convention. Most of us knew Mr. Vance was rotten long before you did." Mrs. Brennan set down the tea tray with a soft clink. "If I may say so, miss, you handled that business at the Ashford ball with exactly the kind of spine Mrs. Langdon would have admired. She always said you had her strength buried beneath that quiet exterior. Just needed the right pressure to bring it to the surface. Like coal transforming into diamond." "Exactly so." The housekeeper moved toward the door, then paused. "Will you be staying here at the summer estate, or returning to the main house?" Susanna considered the question. The main house held 3 years of memories she would rather forget. Rooms where she had shrunk into herself. Corridors where she had learned to make herself invisible. Spaces haunted by the ghost of who she had been forced to become. "I think I'll stay here for a while. This house feels more like home than anywhere else has in years." "I'll have your rooms prepared for an extended visit then, and Miss Susanna, welcome home." After Mrs. Brennan departed, Susanna opened the correspondence. The first several letters were from solicitors representing various business interests, requesting meetings to discuss the Langdon investments now under her sole control. She set those aside for later consideration. There would be time enough to master the empire her mother had built. The next letter was from Dr. Westfield, brief and professional. "I am pleased to hear of the successful resolution of your situation. Should you require any future medical consultations, or simply wish to discuss matters of women's health in a setting free from male presumption, please do not hesitate to contact me. You have proven yourself worthy of the freedom your mother secured for you." Susanna smiled at the phrasing. Worthy of freedom, as though it were something to be earned rather than inherently possessed. But perhaps that was the truth Beatrice had understood, that Susanna needed to prove to herself that she deserved autonomy before she could fully claim it. The final letter bore no seal, just her name written in an unfamiliar, elegant script. Inside was a single page. "Dear Miss Thorne, you do not know me, but I was present at the Ashford ball and witnessed your remarkable courage. I am writing to say thank you. For 5 years I have endured a marriage to a man who tells me I am hysterical when I question his business dealings, who dismisses my concerns as feminine weakness, who has convinced our social circle that I am mentally unstable. Watching you stand in that ballroom and refuse to accept lies as truth gave me hope that I, too, might find the strength to expose deception and reclaim my dignity. You may have intended only to free yourself, but you have inspired others to consider their own freedom. With deepest admiration and gratitude, a friend in similar circumstances." Susanna read the letter 3 times, feeling the weight of responsibility and possibility it represented. Her confrontation with Gideon had not been merely personal vindication. It had been a public demonstration that women could challenge male authority, could question medical diagnoses, could refuse to accept their assigned roles as defective or damaged. How many other women were trapped in marriages built on lies? How many had been diagnosed as barren or hysterical or incompetent by physicians who valued men's narratives over women's actual health? How many carried shame that was never theirs to bear? She thought of the legacy clause, of her mother's requirement that she secure her legacy within 1 year. She had assumed it meant producing an heir or building a business, but perhaps it meant something far more significant. Perhaps it meant using the Langdon fortune and the platform it provided to ensure other women had access to the same kind of protection Beatrice had given her daughter. Independent physicians who would examine them honestly. Solicitors who would structure inheritances to protect rather than control. Legal mechanisms that would expose fraud rather than enabling it. The idea took shape slowly, but with increasing clarity. She could establish a foundation funded by the Langdon estate, dedicated to providing women with independent medical assessments, legal representation, and financial resources to escape fraudulent or abusive marriages. a network of protection that would do for others what her mother had done for her. It would be controversial, certainly. Society would accuse her of encouraging women to abandon their marital duties, of undermining the natural order of male authority. But Susanna had already weathered the scandal of publicly destroying her husband's reputation. What were a few more raised eyebrows compared to the possibility of freeing women from the same trap she had barely escaped? She moved to her mother's desk and pulled out fresh paper, beginning to sketch the outline of what such a foundation might look like. Dr. Westfield could serve as medical director, ensuring women had access to physicians who would examine them honestly rather than confirming convenient diagnoses. Pemberton could establish the legal framework, creating protections similar to the fraud provision in Beatrice's will. The foundation would need a name, something that honored her mother while conveying its purpose. The Langdon Legacy. Too vague. The Thornless Rose Foundation. Too obscure. Then it came to her. The Thorn Foundation. A name that carried both her family identity and the implication of protection, of defense, of refusing to be merely decorative. She wrote for hours, the ideas flowing with a clarity she had never experienced before. This was what it felt like to have purpose beyond simply surviving, to use her resources and position for something larger than herself. This was the legacy her mother had intended. Not just personal freedom, but the transformation of that freedom into action that would ripple outward, touching lives beyond her own. The sun was setting when she finally set down her pen, her hand cramped but her spirit soaring. The outline was rough, but the vision was clear. Within the 6 months remaining before the legacy clause deadline, she could establish the foundation, recruit the necessary physicians and solicitors, and begin offering services to women who needed protection from medical fraud and marital deception. She stood and walked to the window, watching the last light fade from the sky. In the glass, she caught her reflection. Red hair loose around her shoulders, green eyes bright with purpose, spine straight with the confidence of a woman who had reclaimed her own narrative. This was who Beatrice had seen when she looked at her daughter. Not the damaged, barren failure Gideon had created, but a woman with the intelligence, resources, and strength to transform pain into purpose. The legacy clause had never been about producing an heir in the traditional sense. It had been about producing something more valuable, a woman who understood her own worth, who refused to be defined by others' lies, who would use her privilege and power to lift up those still trapped in circumstances she had escaped. Susanna realized she was crying, but these were tears of gratitude rather than shame. Gratitude for a mother brilliant enough to orchestrate her daughter's freedom from beyond death. Gratitude for the strength she hadn't known she possessed until she was forced to find it. Gratitude for the opportunity to transform her suffering into something that might prevent others from suffering similarly. "I understand now," she said softly to her mother's portrait, still visible in the gathering darkness. "The will wasn't just about protecting me from Gideon. It was about teaching me to protect myself so I could help protect others. You didn't just give me money. You gave me the freedom to exist without shame, and the responsibility to use that freedom meaningfully." The painted eyes seemed to gleam with approval in the candlelight. Susanna Langdon Thorne stood alone in her mother's study, but she didn't feel lonely. She felt connected to Beatrice's legacy, to the woman who had written her the anonymous letter, to all the women still carrying shame that wasn't theirs to bear. She had 6 months to fulfill the legacy clause. 6 months to transform her personal vindication into institutional change. 6 months to prove that a thornless rose could grow thorns sharp enough to protect not just herself, but an entire garden of women who deserved the freedom to bloom. The porcelain shell was gone, shattered beyond repair at the Ashford ball. What remained was stronger, a woman tempered by adversity, armed with truth, and committed to ensuring that medical fraud and marital deception would find it increasingly difficult to destroy women's lives unopposed. Beatrice's mysterious will had succeeded beyond what even its brilliant architect might have imagined. It hadn't just given Susanna a fortune, it had given her a purpose, a voice, and the unshakable conviction that she was worthy of taking up space in the world without apology. The final legacy was this: Susanna Thorne, no longer defined by what she lacked, finally ready to define herself by what she would create. And what she would create, she promised her mother's painted eyes, would be a world where fewer women needed to fight the battles she had fought, where medical truth mattered more than masculine convenience, where freedom was a right rather than something to be earned through suffering. The year Beatrice had given her would be enough, not because the work would be complete, that would take generations, but because the foundation would be laid, the first stones placed in a structure that would outlast them both. Susanna smiled in the darkness, feeling her mother's presence like a benediction. "Thank you," she whispered. "For everything. For the fortune, yes, but mostly for teaching me that the greatest inheritance is the freedom to become who I was always meant to be." Outside, the first stars appeared in the October sky, bright and unwavering, and inside the study of the summer estate, a woman with red hair and a spine of steel began to plan the future her mother had died ensuring she would have the chance to claim. The thorn had been reborn, and this time she was blooming exactly as she chose. The end.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.